No attorney, the judge asked me, looking over his glasses. She cannot afford one. My brother laughed, echoing through court. My father nodded proudly while I took off my coat. Then, I asked their lawyer, who signed your security clearance? The entire courtroom went completely silent as they stared back. My name is Beatrice, 34 years old, a widow. If you have been underestimated by your own toxic family, let me know where you are watching from right now. Hit like and subscribe to see how I took control. The fluorescent lights of the mediation room buzzed loudly overhead. They cast a harsh glare on the polished mahogany table. I sat alone on one side wrapped in faded fabric. It was an oversized thrift store puffer coat worn intentionally. On the opposite side sat my family like firing squads. My older brother Trent, 37, dripped with unearned arrogance. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, smirking proudly. Beside him sat his wife Nia, a stunning African-American. Her manicured fingers tapped impatiently against her expensive designer handbag. Nia had always looked down on me with absolute disdain. She viewed my quiet nature as a pathetic, unacceptable weakness. She fiercely protected her own social status and financial security. My parents, Richard and Patricia, flanked them, completing the hostility. At the head of their little syndicate sat Mr. Bradley. He was a high-powered attorney with a smug grin. It had been 3 months since a sudden car accident. It took David from me and shattered my entire world. The grief was still a heavy weight on my chest. Instead of offering comfort, my family circled like hungry vultures. They had always treated me as the ultimate family disappointment. I was just the broke IT help desk worker to them. They claimed I lacked ambition and insulted their curated image. "We are ready to proceed," Judge Mitchell said very quietly. He glanced at the heavy stack of documents before him. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in concern. "Mrs. Beatrice, I must ask you again for the record. You have no attorney present to represent your legal interests." Before I could open my mouth, Trent let out laughs. It was a loud, mocking sound that bounced off walls. "She cannot afford an attorney, Your Honor," Trent sneered confidently. He adjusted his expensive silk tie with a cruel smirk. "My sister is working a measly IT salary right now. She barely makes enough money to cover her electric bill, let alone afford legal representation for a complex probate dispute. We are just trying to expedite this entire legal process. She can quickly move on with her sad, lonely life." My father, Richard, nodded vigorously, his chest puffed out proudly. "Trent is absolutely right," my father chimed in very loudly. "We are simply stepping in to manage things for her. Beatrice clearly lacks the financial literacy to handle this estate. It is a multi-million-dollar estate for her good." "It is entirely for her own good," Richard added firmly. I sat perfectly still, letting their vicious words hang heavily. I did not cry, and I did not defend myself. I just quietly watched them reveal their true greedy colors. "Patricia." My mother leaned forward with a mask of impatience. "Just sign the house over, Beatrice," she snapped at me. Her voice was dripping with extreme condescension and pure malice. "We paid for David his funeral because you were broke. You could not even afford a proper burial for him. Trent knows exactly how to invest the life insurance payout. If we give it to you, you will blow it. You will waste it all on computer parts and gadgets. Sign the deed so Trent can protect the family assets." Naya crossed her arms, her diamond rings catching the light. "Do not make this harder than it needs to be, Beatrice." Nia added coldly. "Trent has a hedge fund running. We do not have all day to hold your hand." Mr. Bradley slid a thick document across the table slowly. It was the will falsely claiming David signed everything over. He signed over our home and all of his money. He supposedly signed over his entire life insurance policy, too. They claimed David wanted Trent to manage all the assets. He allegedly believed I was financially incompetent and completely reckless. Mr. Bradley tapped his expensive gold pen against the paper. "Sign on the dotted line, Beatrice," he said very smoothly. "It is the legal and responsible thing to do today. The court recognizes that your brother is the appointed executor. It is according to this very clear and binding document. I looked down at the forged signature on the page. The letters were shaky, lacking his confident and bold stroke. A massive surge of protective anger flared deep inside me. I kept my breathing slow, steady, and completely under control. I had spent my entire life letting them blindly believe. I let them believe their own false narrative about me. I let them think I was a total failure always. It was much easier than constantly fighting their pathological need. They had a desperate need for superiority and constant validation. But today they had crossed a sacred and unforgivable line. They had used my dead husband to rob me blind. I slowly reached for the zipper of my faded coat. The thick nylon rustled loudly in the quiet, tense room. I pulled it down and slipped my arms out slowly. I let the cheap coat drop to the floor behind. Underneath, I was not wearing the cheap department store clothes. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. The sharp cut of the dark fabric commanded immediate attention. Everything about my appearance screamed absolute and terrifying corporate authority. I ignored my family completely and locked eyes with Bradley. Mr. Bradley, who exactly signed your Level 4 security clearance. The entire courtroom went completely and utterly dead silent today. Mr. Bradley. His smug smile vanished instantly from his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him ghostly pale. His gold pen slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly. It rolled across the polished mahogany table and stopped abruptly. He stared at me, his eyes wide with sudden terror. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I withdrew a solid titanium matte black metal business card. I tossed it onto the table between us with precision. It landed with a heavy metallic clink that echoed ominously. Bradley leaned forward, his breathing growing shallow and incredibly fast. He read the silver-embossed lettering on the metal card. Beatrice, founder and CEO of Apex Cyber Defense Federal Operations. Trent frowned, leaning over to look at the card too. "What is this garbage?" Trent asked, scoffing with manufactured bravado. "Did you print these fake business cards at the library? You are an IT help desk worker." Beatrice stopped playing games. I did not even look at my brother when speaking. I kept my gaze locked on the terrified attorney instead. "I am not an IT worker, Trent," I said quietly. "I am the lead federal cybersecurity auditor around here now. I oversee compliance for every major government contractor and state. Mr. Bradley understands exactly what that means for his firm." Bradley swallowed hard, tugging at the collar of his shirt. He looked like he was about to pass out completely. "Apex Cyber Defense just audited our entire network last month." Bradley whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of dread. "You are the one who holds the keys to everything. You approve our billion-dollar contracts with the Defense Department." I smiled, a cold and calculated expression that offered nothing. "That is exactly right, Mr. Bradley," I confirmed softly today. "And as the lead auditor, I monitor all ethical compliance. I know everything about the firms competing for federal dollars. If the Defense Department found out you submitted massive fraud, if they discovered you presented a forged will in court, that would instantly trigger a massive, irrevocable security compliance breach. Your firm would be blacklisted from all government contracts forever. You would lose billions of dollars in revenue by tomorrow, not to mention the immediate disbarment and federal criminal charges. You would face serious prison time for conspiring to defraud. Is this fake will really worth your entire legal career?" Bradley stared at the forged document sitting on the table. It suddenly looked like a ticking bomb ready to detonate. He looked at Trent, then at Richard, his panic escalating. "You lied to me," Bradley hissed at my father furiously. "You said she was just a broke, clueless, grieving widow. You said she had no resources and would simply fold." Richard sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "She is," Richard yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "She is bluffing. She does not own any cyber company. She is a liar and a massive disappointment to us." Nia narrowed her eyes, studying my custom suit more closely. "Richard, look at her clothes," Nia muttered, her voice tense. That suit alone costs more than your entire car, Richard. She is not bluffing. She is telling the absolute truth. Bradley did not wait for my family to finish arguing. He frantically began shoving his paperwork back into his briefcase. He fumbled with the clasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably now. "Your Honor," Bradley said, turning to the bewildered Judge Mitchell, "I must formally and immediately withdraw as legal counsel today. I can no longer represent Trent in this probate matter." Judge Mitchell blinked, clearly stunned by the sudden dramatic reversal. "Mr. Bradley, you cannot just abandon your client mid-hearing. I am withdrawing, Your Honor," Bradley practically shouted in panic. "Effective immediately, I have absolutely no involvement with this estate. I rescind the submission of that will to the court." He grabbed his briefcase and bolted from the mediation room. He did not even look back at my stunned family. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him with finality. Trent leaped out of his expensive leather chair, screaming loudly. "Bradley, get back here right now!" Trent roared with fury. "You coward! You cannot leave us here without legal representation." Trent paced the floor, his unearned arrogance completely shattered now. My mother, Patricia, clutched her pearls, gasping in dramatic disbelief. Richard glared at me, his eyes burning with pure hatred. "You little witch!" Richard growled, taking a threatening step forward. "What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing here?" Judge Mitchell banged his gavel, his patience entirely worn out. "Order, order in this room," the judge commanded with authority. "Since the petitioner lacks legal counsel, this mediation is suspended. We will reconvene when new representation is secured for him." "We are adjourned," the judge declared, rising from his bench. He gathered his files and quickly exited the tense room. My family stood frozen, processing the massive shift in power. I picked up my vintage designer bag from the floor. I smoothed out a non-existent wrinkle on my blouse. I looked at the people who tried to destroy me. They thought I was weak, broken, and easy to exploit. They thought my grief made me a perfect, helpless target. They were about to learn how dangerously wrong they were. I turned and walked past Richard without a single word. I ignored Patricia and her glaring eyes as I moved. I stopped right next to Trent, leaning in very close. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold, bitter, nervous sweat. I lowered my voice to a whisper only he heard. "See you in the hallway, Trent," I murmured perfectly calmly. "We need to talk about some very important private matters. We need to talk about exactly whose bed you occupied, specifically whose bed you were in when you forged it. When you forged my dead husband his signature last Tuesday." Trent stared at me as his face drained of color. He stumbled backward, knocking his heavy chair over as he scrambled away from the table. The massive wooden doors of the mediation room swung open. My family spilled out into the sprawling marble hallway of the courthouse. I walked out right behind them, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. The echo of our footsteps was deafening in the cavernous space. Before I could even take a breath, Patricia charged at me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She raised her hand high, ready to strike me right across the cheek. I did not flinch. I did not cower the way I had for 34 years. I reached up and caught her wrist mid-air with lightning reflexes. My grip was ironclad, locking her arm entirely in place. Patricia gasped in shock, her eyes widening as she struggled to pull free. "What kind of witchcraft are you pulling?" "Beatrice," my mother hissed venomously. Her voice echoed sharply off the cold stone walls. "You are trying to rob your brother. You are trying to humiliate us. You have been a jealous, spiteful burden since you were 10 years old, and he won that state science fair. You could never stand seeing Trent shine." I shoved her arm away smoothly, stepping into her personal space. "A science fair, Patricia?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "He stole my volcano project, and you told me to let him take the credit because boys needed academic confidence more than girls. You have been feeding him my accomplishments for decades." Patricia stumbled back, rubbing her wrist with a dramatic, exaggerated wince. "You are delusional," Patricia cried out, looking at the others for support. "She is making up lies to steal from her own family." Richard stomped forward, his heavy dress shoes pounding against the floor. He used his large frame to corner me against the cold marble wall. He tried to loom over me using the exact same physical intimidation tactics that used to terrify me when I was a child. He pointed a thick, stubby finger right in my face. "You listen to me right now, you ungrateful little brat," Richard growled deeply. "I bailed out Trent and his hedge fund with $500,000 last month. I did that because he is actually building a legacy for this family name. He is expanding our wealth while you sit around mourning a dead man." I stared at the vein bulging in my father his neck. The absolute audacity of his words sent a cold shockwave through my system. He was admitting to funding my brother his failing gambling habits with family money. "David is dead," Richard continued callously, showing absolutely no respect for my late husband. "You do not need a $1.2 million house all for yourself. What is a single childless widow going to do with 4 bedrooms? You are being selfish and greedy. Sign the deed over to Trent today. If you do that, I will personally lend you $2,000 for a studio apartment downtown. You can go back to your pathetic little life and stay out of our way." I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. I looked at the father who viewed my massive tragedy as a real estate opportunity for his favorite son. "You want me to give up my marital home?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously quiet. "You want me to hand over the house David and I bought together so Trent can cover his massive financial failures?" Trent scoffed loudly from a few feet away, recovering a tiny bit of his bravado. "They are not failures," Beatrice Trent snapped, adjusting his collar nervously. "It is called market volatility. You would not understand high-level finance. You just fix internet routers for a living. I need that equity to secure my commercial margins." "You need my house to pay off your shadow loans, Trent," I corrected him sharply. I saw his eyes dart around the hallway in sudden panic. "You think I do not know about the massive liquidity crisis your little fund is facing right now? I know exactly how much debt you are drowning in." Richard slammed his palm against the wall right next to my head. "Stop making up garbage about your brother," Richard roared. "You will sign that property transfer today, or I will make sure you never see a single dime from this family ever again. We will bleed you dry in probate court for years until you are begging for that $2,000 loan." They really believed they had the upper hand. They truly thought my tailored suit and my federal title were just a temporary illusion. They were so blinded by their lifelong habit of crushing me that they could not see the massive trap closing around them. I opened my mouth to completely dismantle my father, his empty threat. I was fully prepared to break down exactly how much power I held over his pathetic existence today. But before I could speak, another voice cut through the tension. It was smooth, confident, and dripping with absolute upper-class condescension. "Let me handle this, Richard." Nia stepped forward, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor. My sister-in-law was a vision of expensive perfection. Her sleek hair was styled flawlessly, and her designer dress clung to her frame. She was dripping in brilliant diamonds that caught the courthouse lights. As an African-American woman who married into my toxic family, she had quickly learned to play their vicious game better than anyone else. Nia was incredibly sharp, fiercely intelligent, and utterly obsessed with maintaining her luxurious social status. She had always viewed my simple lifestyle as a personal insult to her brand. She stopped right in front of me, perfectly manicured and completely poised. She stood very tall and proud. She looked me up and down, analyzing my Tom Ford suit with a skeptical, calculating gaze. She was entirely ready to put her supposedly broke sister-in-law firmly in her place today. Before Trent could even attempt to stammer out a pathetic lie, Nia stepped directly between us. She physically shielded her husband with her rigid posture. She hitched her heavily logoed Hermes Birkin bag higher up on her forearm. The solid gold hardware on the bag clinked softly in the tense silence of the courthouse hallway. She tilted her chin up and looked down her perfectly contoured nose at me. Her dark eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of any human empathy. She had always viewed my grief as an annoying inconvenience to her meticulously curated social calendar. "Beatrice, stop throwing these ridiculous public tantrums!" Nia said, her voice sharp and ringing with absolute superiority. It is embarrassing for all of us. You are standing in a federal building screaming about conspiracy theories because you are upset about a house. You need to grow up and face reality today. I kept my expression entirely neutral. I let her dig her own grave. You listen to me! Nia continued, stepping closer. She lowered her voice to a harsh, scolding whisper meant to put me firmly in my place. Black women like me have to work twice as hard to get to this tax bracket. We do not get handed trust funds, and we certainly do not let assets depreciate out of sheer sentimentality. I built my status from the ground up, and Trent knows exactly how to protect and multiply our wealth. He is a financial visionary. You, on the other hand, are just a bitter, grieving widow throwing a massive pity party because you do not understand how real money works in the real world. Patricia clapped her hands together in immediate agreement from the sidelines. Listen to your sister-in-law, Beatrice Patricia chimed in loudly. She is the only one making any sense right now. Nia held her hand up, silencing my mother instantly. Nia liked to be the only one holding the floor. David is gone, Beatrice. Nia said, her tone dripping with fake weaponized sympathy now. It is tragic, but it is the truth. You need to stop making this about your bruised ego. That signature on the will is absolutely real. You are insulting my integrity by claiming otherwise. I stood right there in our home office and watched him sign it. I witnessed the execution of that document myself. I put my own name on the witness line. Are you calling me a liar, Beatrice? The sheer arrogance radiating from her was suffocating. She was so blinded by her blind faith in Trent and her own superiority complex that she had willfully signed a fraudulent legal document without a second thought. She had tethered her entire flawless reputation to a sinking ship. I looked at her perfectly painted lips and her defiant glare. Then I laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a cold, chilling, and deeply predatory sound. It echoed off the marble walls of the corridor and made my father physically flinch. The laugh carried years of suppressed rage and the absolute certainty of my impending victory. Nia, her confident mask cracked just a fraction. She narrowed her eyes. What is so funny? She demanded sharply. You witnessed it, Nia, I asked, my voice dropping an octave. I slowly unzipped my structured leather tote bag. You are absolutely sure about that? You are willing to stake your reputation, your massive diamond ring, and your freedom on the claim that you stood in your home office and watched your husband execute that document? I am warning you, Beatrice, Nia snapped, taking a defensive step back. Do not play these childish games with me. I pulled out my sleek silver iPad Pro from my bag. The screen illuminated my face in the dim hallway light. I did not break eye contact with her as I unlocked the device with a quick swipe. My fingers moved rapidly across the glass screen, pulling up the exact file I had prepared for this very moment. I am not playing games, Nia, I said softly. I am ending them. Trent suddenly lunged forward. His face was slick with a fresh layer of nervous sweat. Wait! Beatrice, Trent shouted frantically. He reached out with both hands, trying to physically block the screen from his wife. Let us just step outside and talk about this like adults. We do not need to look at any screens right now. I will give you whatever you want. Nia shoved Trent away with a violent thrust of her elbow. Her sharp instincts had finally caught up to the escalating panic in his voice. She knew a cornered rat when she saw one. Shut up, Trent, Nia commanded fiercely. She turned her fierce gaze back to me. Show me what you have on that screen right now, Beatrice. Show me what you think gives you the right to question my integrity. I tapped the glowing screen one final time and flipped the heavy tablet around so it faced her directly. I held it up right at her eye level, forcing her to read the highlighted lines of code. You see, Nia, I began breaking down the technical data into plain, brutal English. When Trent used a digital signature platform to supposedly capture David his final wishes, he made a massive, incredibly stupid mistake. He forgot that I am a federal cybersecurity expert. I do not just read the typed words on a page. I extract the hidden metadata embedded deep inside the digital file. Nia, her eyes darted across the complex digital report. She read the highlighted red text. She was smart enough to immediately grasp that this was not a fake document. Every digital action leaves a permanent, unalterable footprint, I explained smoothly, stepping closer to her. This report shows the exact geographic coordinates, the specific device ID, and the precise timestamp of when that signature was generated. If you truly witnessed this document in your home office last Tuesday evening, the IP address would trace straight back to your expensive gated community in the suburbs. I paused, letting the heavy silence amplify the incoming strike. But it does not trace back to your house, Nia, I said, my voice slicing through the air like a razor blade. The IP address where this will was signed is going to be a massive and immediate problem for your precious marriage. I watched her eyes scan down to the bottom of the screen. I watched her read the exact address listed on the unalterable forensic report. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. The expensive Birkin bag slipped down her arm, entirely forgotten. Because that IP address traces directly to a luxury high-rise penthouse in the downtown financial district, I revealed loudly, ensuring my parents heard every single word. A penthouse that your husband currently leases under a hidden shell corporation. Trent let out a strangled, pathetic noise from the back of his throat. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, waiting for the lever to be pulled. My father, Richard, stared at Trent in absolute confusion, unable to comprehend the disaster unfolding before his eyes. My mother, Patricia, stood frozen, clutching her purse, her mouth hanging wide open in silent shock. Nia did not blink. She stared at the screen as the horrific reality of the situation washed over her perfectly contoured face. Her entire wealthy, secure existence was built on a foundation of lies, and she was just now seeing the cracks. I leaned in close enough to smell her expensive imported perfume. I delivered the final devastating blow straight to her core. You did not witness anything, Nia, I whispered coldly. You lied to a federal judge to protect him, and Trent signed that document on the bed of his secret apartment while you were busy defending his honor. I slid the iPad Pro directly into the palms of Nia, her rigid hands. She did not want to take the device, but her eyes were already glued to the glowing high-resolution screen. Her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around the sleek metal casing almost involuntarily. I tapped the center of the glass, pulling up the second page of my comprehensive forensic data report. I made sure the brightness was turned all the way up so there was absolutely no mistaking the evidence glaring right back at her. Let me break down the technical evidence for you in plain, brutal English, Nia, I said, keeping my voice razor-sharp and completely steady. The IP address logged by the electronic signature software at the exact moment of execution does not match your secure home network. It does not match Trent, his private office network, either. I ran a standard federal-level trace on that specific network location. It belongs to a dedicated commercial fiber optic line installed at the Apex Tower downtown. Trent let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded more like a choke. He wiped his hands on his expensive tailored trousers. She is making this up. Nia, Trent shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. It is a virtual private network. I use a VPN for my hedge fund security. She hacked into my files and altered the data to frame me because she is furious about losing the house. I did not even bother looking at my brother. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my sister-in-law. A virtual private network masks an IP address. Trent, I corrected him with lethal precision. It does not magically generate a matching physical commercial lease agreement. I reached over and swiped left on the iPad screen. A scanned copy of a signed leasing contract appeared. I pulled the public property records for that specific penthouse unit. It is leased to a shell company called Blue Horizon Holdings. Nia stared at the leasing document, her dark eyes scanning the text rapidly. She was a highly intelligent woman, and she knew exactly how to read corporate filings. I watched her perfectly contoured face remain totally frozen as the terrible reality began to set in. You formed that limited liability company exactly 3 days after David died, Trent. I continued relentlessly. I made sure to project my voice so my parents could hear every single devastating detail. And the registered occupant of that $5,000 a month luxury penthouse is not you, Trent. It is a 23-year-old fitness model named Lexi. She is an aspiring influencer who posts quite frequently from that very bedroom. Richard stepped away from the wall, his jaw dropping open. $5,000 a month. Richard demanded, his face turning purple with fresh outrage. You are spending $5,000 a month on an apartment downtown, while you are begging me for bailout money. Trent ignored our father completely. He was sweating profusely now. Thick beads of moisture gathered on his forehead and upper lip. He looked like an animal caught tightly in a trap, desperately chewing off its own leg to escape. Naya, baby. Listen to me, Trent pleaded, raising his hands in a placating gesture. This is a complete fabrication. She is using her cybersecurity skills to forge these records. She wants to destroy our marriage to get back at the family. Do not let her manipulate you. I swiped to the final slide on the iPad. It displayed a grid of high-resolution photographs downloaded directly from a public social media account. I did not forge her Instagram feed, Trent, I said coldly. Take a close look at those photos, Nia. Notice the very distinct custom velvet headboard in the background of her selfies. Notice the specific view of the skyline from those floor-to-ceiling windows. I ran a geospatial analysis on the photos. That is the exact penthouse. That is the exact bed where the geolocation pinpointed the device that forged my dead husband his signature. Trent was lying in his mistress her bed when he decided to steal my marital home. Patricia pushed her way forward, trying to insert herself between Nia and the screen. Why are you doing this, Beatrice? Patricia shrieked, waving her hands frantically. You are trying to ruin your brother his beautiful marriage over a stupid piece of real estate. You are a wicked, spiteful girl. You should be ashamed of yourself for bringing this garbage into a public courthouse. I turned my glacial gaze toward my mother, shutting her down instantly. I am not doing anything, Patricia, I snapped back, my voice echoing sharply. Trent did this entirely to himself when he decided to steal from a grieving widow to fund his secret side piece. He brought this garbage into the light the second he submitted a fraudulent document to a federal judge. Nia did not hear my mother at all. She did not hear Richard shouting about the wasted money. Nia was completely absorbed by the screen in her hands. The arrogant, superior facade she had worn just moments ago shattered into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. The haughty confidence drained from her posture, leaving behind a rigid, terrifying stillness. Her eyes darted rapidly from the photographs of the young model straight to the sweating face of her husband. The color left Nia her cheeks and then rushed back in a wave of pure, unadulterated fury. She realized in an instant that her entire wealthy, secure, and flawless existence was built on a humiliating lie. Her golden boy husband was a broke, cheating fraud who was dumb enough to leave a digital trail leading right to his infidelity. Trent lunged forward, his panic finally overriding his common sense. "Give me that piece of garbage," Trent yelled aggressively. He reached out with thick, sweaty hands, trying to violently rip the tablet from her grasp. "I will smash that thing into pieces. You are not looking at her lies anymore, Nia." Nia moved with a speed and ferocity that caught Trent completely off guard. She snatched the iPad away and held it out of his reach. In the exact same fluid motion, she stepped directly into his personal space. She raised her free hand and drove her perfectly manicured, sharp acrylic nails directly into the center of Trent's chest. She grabbed the expensive fabric of his shirt and twisted it violently in her fist. She pushed forward, using her heels to gain leverage. She forced Trent backward until his shoulders hit the cold marble wall of the courthouse hallway with a heavy thud. He let out a gasp of pain and shock. "Who the hell is Lexi Trent?" Nia demanded, her voice a low, vibrating growl of absolute menace. Trent swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk collar. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender while remaining pinned against the cold marble wall. "Nia, please listen to me," Trent begged, his voice cracking. "There is no Lexi. Beatrice is lying. She just told us she is a federal cybersecurity CEO. She literally hacks into systems for a living. She fabricated this entire digital report to frame me because she is furious about losing the house. It is a fake document, Nia." Nia did not loosen her grip on his tailored shirt. Her eyes were burning with a terrifying, calculating fire. She leaned closer, pressing her acrylic nails deeper into his chest. "Do not insult my intelligence," Trent Nia hissed sharply. "You are sweating like a pig in a slaughterhouse. If this is a fake document, then prove it right now. Give me your secondary phone. Give me the encrypted device you claim is strictly for secure hedge fund communications, the one you lock in your briefcase every single night, the one you take into the bathroom with you at 2 in the morning." Trent, his eyes widened in sheer panic. He instinctively shifted his weight, trying to shield the left pocket of his suit jacket. "I cannot do that," Nia Trent stammered, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "It has highly classified client data on it. It is a federal violation for me to let anyone else access that device. You know the SEC regulations." I chuckled softly from a few feet away. I crossed my arms and watched the glorious implosion. "The Securities and Exchange Commission does not care about your encrypted messages to a 23-year-old fitness model, Trent," I pointed out calmly. "And since I am a federal compliance auditor, I can assure you that handing your phone to your wife does not violate any financial regulations." Nia snapped her free hand toward his left pocket. Trent tried to twist away, but he was trapped against the wall. "Give me the phone," Trent Nia demanded, her voice echoing loudly down the corridor. "If you have nothing to hide, you will unlock it right now." Before Trent could surrender or fight back, Patricia pushed herself into the center of the conflict. My mother inserted her body between Nia and Trent, acting as a human shield for her precious golden boy. Patricia grabbed Nia by the wrist, trying to forcefully peel her away from Trent. "Nia, stop this ridiculous behavior right now," Patricia ordered in her most condescending, aristocratic tone. "You are making a massive public spectacle of our family. People are staring at us. You are letting Beatrice manipulate you with her vicious little computer tricks. Trent is a loyal, loving husband, and he is trying to protect our legacy. Let him go and calm down immediately." Nia ripped her arm out of Patricia, her grasp with stunning force. She turned her blazing dark eyes onto my mother. "Do not ever tell me to calm down, Patricia," Nia warned, her voice dropping to a lethal volume. "I am not one of your subservient little country club friends, and do not talk to me about protecting this family legacy. I funded his initial startup with my own personal inheritance. I liquidated my grandfather his trust fund because you swore your son was a financial genius. You looked me in the eye and promised me he would multiply my wealth." Patricia took a step back, shocked by the aggressive pushback. She tried to maintain her haughty posture. "He is a genius," Patricia insisted, blindly defending her son. "Trent just needs a little more capital to secure his market position. Beatrice is just a jealous, spiteful woman trying to tear him down because her own husband was a loser. If your son is funding a secret mistress with my family money, I will completely ruin him," Nia shouted, ignoring Patricia entirely now. Nia turned back to Trent and lunged for his pocket. She managed to grab the sleek black smartphone. Trent grabbed her hand, trying to wrestle the device away, but Nia was fueled by pure adrenaline. She shoved the phone directly into Trent, his face activating the facial recognition unlock feature instantly. The screen illuminated the dim hallway. Nia swiped rapidly through the home screen and opened his encrypted messaging application. The silence in the hallway was deafening as Nia scrolled through the messages. Her perfectly contoured face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute disgust. Trent backed away, rubbing his neck, looking like a cornered coward. "Nia, please let me explain." Trent whimpered. It meant nothing. She was just a distraction from the stress of the fund. Nia did not look up from the screen. She began reading the messages aloud, her voice dripping with venom. "Good morning, baby. I love the new diamond necklace you sent. Can you come over to the penthouse tonight?" Nia looked up, her eyes cold and dead. "You bought her diamonds, Trent. You bought her diamonds while you were telling me we needed to put a second mortgage on our house to cover your business expenses." Patricia gasped, clasping her hands over her mouth. She finally realized that her golden boy was entirely exposed. But instead of holding him accountable, she immediately turned her anger toward me. "This is your fault, Beatrice," Patricia cried out, pointing a shaking finger at me. You deliberately sought out this information to destroy your brother his marriage. You could have come to us privately, but you chose to humiliate him in a public courthouse. You are a monster. I did not flinch. I did not care about her manufactured tears. You brought me to a public courthouse to steal my marital home. Patricia, I replied coldly. You tried to leave me completely destitute. I am simply matching your energy. Richard watched the entire scene unfold with growing horror. He saw his wealthy daughter-in-law slipping away. He knew that without Nia, her immense financial backing Trent, his hedge fund would collapse completely. That collapse would instantly drag Richard and Patricia down into absolute bankruptcy. Richard realized he was losing control of the entire situation. He had to pivot the attack back to me immediately. He had to crush me to regain his power. Richard marched forward, his face turning a deep, violently angry purple. He pushed Patricia aside and stepped directly into my personal space. He pointed a thick, trembling finger right between my eyes. You think you have won this, Beatrice? Richard snarled, his voice a deep, menacing rumble. You think you can waltz in here in a fancy suit and tear my family apart? You think you can sit on your high horse and judge your brother? I stared right back at him, completely unbothered. I am not judging him, Richard, I said smoothly. I am eviscerating him. Richard curled his lip into a cruel, ugly sneer. He reached into his own tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded manila envelope. He tapped the heavy envelope aggressively against my chest. David did not die a saint, Beatrice. Richard spat out loudly, ensuring everyone in the hallway heard him. His former tech firm filed a massive corporate embezzlement suit against him right before his tragic little accident. He stole millions of dollars from his partners. I quietly bought that exact debt from his former firm to protect this family from a public scandal. I hold the sole rights to that lawsuit now. I stood perfectly still, letting his threat hang in the air. If you do not walk back into that courtroom and sign your house over to Trent immediately, I will release these files to the media today, Richard threatened, his voice echoing with malice. I will drag David, his name, through the absolute mud. He will go down in local history as a common thief and a fraud, and you will forever be known as the pathetic, oblivious widow of a criminal. Patricia stepped up next to Richard, sensing the shift in power. Her toxic, sweet smile returned to her face. She placed a hand on my arm, squeezing tightly. Sign the deed, sweetie, Patricia whispered with dripping malice. Hand the house over to Trent right now, or tomorrow morning I will personally call every single friend and high-level client you have. I will tell them that intense grief has driven you completely insane. I will tell them you are suffering from severe delusions and paranoia. Who is going to trust a cybersecurity CEO who has clearly lost her grip on reality? Nia looked up from the phone, watching the new dynamic unfold. She remained silent, clutching the device, waiting to see how I would handle the blackmail. Trent wiped his sweaty face, his smug smirk slowly returning as his father fought his battle for him. Richard tapped the manila envelope against my chest one more time. You are trapped, Beatrice, Richard growled triumphantly. You can keep your fancy suit and your little federal title, but you will give us the house. You will surrender the life insurance money. You will do exactly what I tell you to do, or I will completely destroy the only thing you have left. I will destroy your dead husband, his legacy. Make your choice right now. Nia adjusted the strap of her immaculate Hermes Birkin bag, shifting the heavy gold hardware so it caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courthouse corridor. She ran a hand down the side of her sleek designer dress, smoothing out invisible wrinkles. She looked down her perfectly contoured nose at me, her dark eyes narrowing with a mixture of pity and intense irritation. The air around her smelled of expensive sandalwood perfume, a stark contrast to the sterile municipal scent of the building. She did not see me as an equal. She saw me as a temporary obstacle blocking her path to a more opulent lifestyle. She had spent years perfecting her image, and she viewed my very existence as a stain on her carefully constructed world. Beatrice, stop throwing these pathetic public tantrums. Nia began, her voice a low, dangerous murmur designed to command absolute authority. She stepped closer, invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. You are making a massive spectacle of yourself, and it is frankly embarrassing for everyone involved. We are standing in a federal building, and you are acting like a petulant child denied a toy. You need to understand how the real world operates outside of your little suburban grief bubble. Black women like me have to work twice as hard to get to this tax bracket. We do not get handed trust funds, and we do not have the luxury of letting assets depreciate just because we are feeling sad. We build empires. We protect our legacy at all costs. We do not let emotion dictate our financial security. She paused to let her words sink in, expecting me to wither under her aggressive confidence. My parents stood behind her, nodding in silent agreement, perfectly happy to let Nia act as their elegant attack dog. Richard actually smiled, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He loved seeing someone else put me in my place. Trent knows exactly how to protect and multiply wealth. Nia continued, pointing a manicured finger clad in a massive diamond ring directly at my chest. He is making the hard decisions that you are too weak to make. You are just a widow, throwing a desperate pity party because things did not go your way. You are wallowing in the past while Trent is building the future. You want to blame him for your own stagnation. But that signature on the will is entirely real, Beatrice. I know it is real because I witnessed it myself. I stood right next to him in our home office and watched him sign those documents. I put my own name on the witness line to ensure everything was handled legally and properly. You are insulting my integrity and my marriage by claiming otherwise. Nia crossed her arms over her designer dress, radiating absolute certainty. She truly believed her own lies. Or perhaps she believed her status made her lies bulletproof. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to burst into tears, apologize, and run away from the sheer force of her upper-class bullying. She thought her wealth and her volume would simply steamroll over my grief. Instead, I laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh or a nervous chuckle. It was a cold, chilling sound that echoed off the high marble walls of the courthouse. The sound carried 34 years of suppressed rage and the absolute certainty of a predator closing its jaws around its prey. The sound was so entirely unexpected that Nia actually flinched, taking a half step back. Her perfectly arched eyebrows furrowed in sudden confusion. Her posture broke for a fraction of a second. My mother gasped quietly from the sidelines, entirely unused to seeing me show anything other than submission. Richard dropped his arms, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly. I stopped laughing and let a heavy, suffocating silence fall over the hallway. I maintained unblinking eye contact with Nia, watching the first tiny cracks of doubt form in her arrogant facade. I slowly reached into my tailored blazer, taking my time deliberately drawing out the suspense. I pulled out my sleek silver iPad Pro. "You witnessed it, Nia?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. "You are absolutely sure about that? You are willing to stake your entire reputation, your social standing, and your freedom on the claim that you stood in your home office and watched your husband execute that document?" I did not wait for her to answer. I unlocked the screen with a quick swipe of my finger. The bright light of the tablet illuminated my face, casting sharp shadows against the stone walls. I navigated directly to the secure file I had prepared earlier that morning. "You see, Nia, you made one critical miscalculation when you decided to join Trent in this little conspiracy." I explained, my tone completely flat and clinical. "You assumed my career was just fixing internet routers. You assumed I was just a basic IT worker plugging in cables for a living. But I am a federal cybersecurity expert. I deal with digital fraud, encrypted data, and federal tracing at the highest levels of government. I hunt down cybercriminals who are infinitely smarter than your husband." Trent suddenly shifted his weight, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. A heavy bead of sweat formed on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off, instantly slicing through the air with my words. I opened the highly detailed forensic data report on the screen and turned the iPad so it faced Nia directly. The screen was filled with complex lines of code, geographic coordinates, and digital timestamps highlighted in bright, glaring red. When you use a digital signature platform, it does not just record the typed name. I continued, forcing Nia to look at the undeniable proof. It captures a massive amount of hidden metadata. It creates a permanent, unalterable digital footprint that cannot be erased by simply clicking a button. I extracted the exact metadata from this specific DocuSign file. I traced the precise origin of the execution down to the exact geographical coordinates. Every single person in the hallway stopped moving. The distant sounds of the courthouse faded away entirely. Trent looked like he was about to pass out. His hands began to shake visibly, and his face drained of all color. He looked from the iPad to his wife, his eyes wide with a frantic, trapped panic. He knew exactly what that IP address meant, and he knew exactly how much danger he was in. I stepped right into Nia, her personal space mirroring the exact intimidation tactics she had used on me moments earlier. If you witnessed this document in your suburban home office, the IP address would reflect that secure network, I stated loudly, ensuring my voice carried down the entire hallway. But it does not, Nia. The IP address logged at the exact second of signing does not belong to your house, and it is going to be a massive problem for your marriage. I lowered my head. I let my chin drop toward my chest and allowed my shoulders to begin shaking. The movement was slight at first, and then it grew more pronounced. My entire frame trembled under the weight of Richard, his ultimate dirty trump card. The reaction from my family was instantaneous. I heard my father exhale a loud, heavy breath of pure, triumphant satisfaction. He actually patted my mother on the shoulder, a sickening gesture of shared malice. Patricia let out a soft, victorious sigh, adjusting her silk scarf with eager anticipation. Even Trent, who was still pinned against the wall by a furious Nia, managed to summon a weak, pathetic smirk. They all thought they had finally broken me. They truly believed they had successfully crushed the last remaining spark of defiance I possessed. Nia, however, remained perfectly still. Her hands were still curled into fists by her sides. She was watching me with narrow, calculating eyes. She did not look triumphant. She looked incredibly suspicious. She knew a trap when she saw one. I kept my head down for another 5 seconds, letting my parents bask in their false glory. I let them savor the illusion of victory. Then I slowly lifted my face. I was not crying. There were no tears of defeat streaming down my cheeks. My shoulders were shaking because I was laughing. A deep, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest and spilled out into the cold courthouse hallway. It was a dark, melodic sound that instantly shattered the arrogant atmosphere my father had just tried to build. Richard took a sudden step backward, his thick fingers loosening their grip on the manila envelope. His dark eyes widened in total confusion and a sudden spike of primal fear. "What is wrong with you?" Richard demanded, his voice completely losing its confident rumble. "Did you not hear a single word I just said? I hold the power to completely destroy David, his entire reputation. I hold the power to ruin your life." I reached out and smoothly plucked the manila envelope right out of his meaty hand. He was too stunned by my reaction to even resist. I did not even bother opening the flap to look inside. I simply weighed the thick package in my palm before tossing it carelessly onto a nearby marble bench. It landed with a dull thud that echoed down the corridor. "You did not buy any debt, Richard," I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "You bought a fabricated settlement agreement, and you did not do it to protect this family. You did it to protect yourself." Patricia scoffed, taking an aggressive step forward. "You are speaking nonsense, Beatrice," Patricia hissed. "Your father spent a massive fortune saving your husband his disgraced name. You should be down on your knees thanking him instead of having a psychotic break in public. I am making that phone call to your clients the second we leave this building. You are unhinged." "Make the call, Patricia," I challenged her, stepping directly into her path. "Call every federal contractor I work with. Tell them I am suffering from severe delusions. I am sure they will find that fascinating, considering I spent the last 3 months compiling a massive digital harassment file against you. I have legally recorded every single unhinged voicemail you left me demanding my house. I have documented every threatening text message. My legal team already submitted the entire file to the local authorities to establish a preliminary restraining order. If you make one phone call trying to defame my character, I will have you arrested for aggravated stalking before dinner time. Patricia, her jaw snapped shut. The malicious smile vanished from her face, leaving her looking incredibly old and suddenly very fragile. She took a step back, bumping into Richard. I turned my attention back to my father. He was staring at the discarded manila envelope on the bench like it was a live grenade. "Let us talk about David and this supposed embezzlement suit," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward Richard. "You claim he stole millions from his former tech firm. But David was a senior systems architect. He did not handle corporate funds. He handled encrypted data streams. He handled secure network architecture. Do you really want to know what he actually found hidden in those servers before he died?" Richard swallowed hard. The violent purple hue of his face rapidly faded into a sickly pale gray. "Shut your mouth," Beatrice Richard hissed, a desperate edge creeping into his tone. "Do not say another word right now." "I am going to say all of the words, Richard," I replied loudly, ensuring that Nia and Trent caught every single syllable. David did not steal anything. He discovered that the board of directors at his tech firm was laundering massive amounts of money through a network of offshore shell accounts. He found the hidden digital ledger. He was preparing to become a federal whistleblower. And when the board found out, he knew they panicked. They fabricated an embezzlement charge to discredit him, to bury him in legal fees, and destroy his reputation before he could go to the authorities. Nia slowly turned her head to look at Richard. Her sharp legal and financial mind was already connecting the dots. She let go of Trent and took a step toward my father. "If they fabricated the charge," Nia asked, her voice dangerously quiet, "why would Richard buy the debt quietly? Why would he pay millions to settle a fake lawsuit for a son-in-law he hated?" I smiled at my sister-in-law. It was a cold predator-to-predator smile. "Because Richard was not protecting David," I explained smoothly. "Richard was one of the silent investors involved in the money laundering scheme. His name was on that offshore digital ledger. David found out that his own father-in-law was using his corporate tech firm to wash dirty money. And worse, Richard was funneling those dirty funds straight through Trent, his failing hedge fund, to make the books look clean." Trent let out a high-pitched gasp. His knees buckled slightly and he slid down the marble wall until he was crouching on the floor. He buried his face in his hands. He knew. He had known the whole time that his hedge fund was just a glorified washing machine for syndicate cash. Nia stared at Trent in absolute revulsion. Her chest heaved as she processed the magnitude of the betrayal. "You used my clean inheritance to cover your tracks," Nia whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying rage. "You mixed my grandfather, his clean money, with dirty offshore syndicate funds. You turned me into an accomplice." Richard lunged forward, raising his heavy hand toward me. "You lying, ungrateful brat!" Richard roared, his face contorted in violent desperation. I did not even flinch. Before his hand could come anywhere near my face, Nia stepped forward and shoved Richard back with both hands. Her eyes were blazing with an unstoppable intensity. She had just discovered her husband was a cheating fraud, and now she was realizing her father-in-law was a federal criminal. She had married into a family of absolute grifters, and she was furious. "Do not even think about touching her," Richard, Nia commanded fiercely. Her voice cracked through the hallway like a whip. "Let her finish. I want to hear exactly how deep this rot goes. I want to know exactly how much federal prison time you are all facing." Patricia began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest, as the pristine illusion of her upper-class life caught fire and burned to the ground. She looked wildly between her crouching son, her raging daughter-in-law, and her terrified husband. David confronted him. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my father. David told Richard he was going to turn over the hard drives to the FBI. He gave Richard 1 week to turn himself in. But David died in a tragic car accident 4 days later. A highly convenient accident that saved you from spending the rest of your pathetic life in a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of my words crushed the remaining oxygen out of the hallway. Richard looked like a man who was having a heart attack. He staggered backward, hitting the same marble wall his son was currently sobbing against. "You bought that fabricated debt from the tech firm to permanently seal the investigation," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "You paid them millions to make sure nobody ever looked into his files. You thought you buried the evidence when you buried my husband." I reached into my tailored bag one more time. I pulled out a small encrypted flash drive encased in brushed steel. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger, letting the courthouse lights catch the metal. "But David did not just leave me a house, Richard," I whispered. "He left me his backup drives. He left me the master ledger. He left me every single piece of data required to put you, Trent, and your entire board of directors behind bars for a very long time." Richard stared at the small silver drive. He was completely broken. The arrogant, bullying patriarch who had tormented me for 34 years was gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate old man facing total ruin. "You are going to walk back into that mediation room, Richard," I ordered, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "You are going to sign a document formally revoking any and all claims to my property. Trent is going to sign a confession admitting to forging the transfer deed, and Patricia is going to sit in silence and watch her entire world end. And if we refuse," Trent squeaked out from the floor, his voice cracking with fear. I smiled, putting the flash drive back into my bag. "Then I walk out of this building and I hand these files directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You can keep your fake embezzlement suit, Richard. I am keeping my house, my money, and my dignity. Make your choice right now." I lowered my head, letting my chin drop toward my chest. My shoulders began to tremble slightly at first, and then the movement grew much more pronounced. I let my entire frame shake under the suffocating weight of Richard, his ultimate dirty trump card. The reaction from my family was instantaneous and entirely predictable. I heard my father exhale a loud, heavy breath of pure, triumphant satisfaction. He had played his masterstroke, and he fully believed he had completely destroyed me. He actually patted my mother on the shoulder, a sickening gesture of shared malice and victory. Patricia let out a soft sigh, adjusting her silk scarf with eager anticipation. Her toxic smile widened as she watched me staring at the floor. She was already mentally spending the money from my house. They thought they had finally broken the defiant daughter. They truly believed they had successfully crushed the last remaining spark of independence I possessed. Trent, who was still pinned against the cold marble wall by a furious Nia, saw the sudden shift in the power dynamic. He watched my shaking shoulders, and his cowardly mind immediately calculated an opening. He managed to summon a weak, pathetic smirk. He brushed Nia her hand away from his tailored shirt, using the distraction of my apparent emotional breakdown to wiggle out of her iron grasp. He stepped forward, rolling his shoulders and straightening his posture. He ran a hand through his expensive haircut, trying desperately to recapture the arrogant swagger of a successful hedge fund manager. He looked at his wife, pointing a dismissive finger in my direction. "See?" Nia Trent said, his voice dripping with practiced condescension. "It is just Beatrice being hysterical. She is having a complete mental breakdown right in the middle of the courthouse. My father is just trying to protect the family from her paranoid delusions." Nia remained perfectly still, her hands curled into tight fists by her sides. She did not look convinced. She looked incredibly suspicious. Her dark eyes darted from Trent to me, calculating the situation with cold precision. She was a highly intelligent woman, and she knew a trap when she saw one. She did not say a word, simply watching the scene unfold with hawk-like intensity. Trent, however, was too blinded by his own arrogance to read the room. Emboldened by his father, his blackmail, and my apparent surrender, he stepped directly into my personal space. He reached out his hand, aiming straight for the silver iPad I still held loosely at my side. "Hand over the iPad," Beatrice Trent demanded, acting like the dominant older brother he always pretended to be. "We are done playing games. You are going to sign the deed and give us the device before you embarrass yourself any further." His fingers brushed the cold metal edge of my tablet. I stopped shaking. I snapped my head up. I was not crying. There were absolutely no tears of defeat streaming down my cheeks, My shoulders were shaking because I was laughing. A deep, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest and spilled out into the quiet hallway. It was a dark, predatory sound that instantly shattered the arrogant atmosphere my father and brother had just tried to build. Before Trent could comprehend what was happening, I swung my free arm. I slapped his extended hand away with stunning force. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh echoed loudly off the high marble ceilings. Trent let out a startled yelp, snatching his hand back and cradling it against his chest. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor as his eyes went wide with absolute shock. "Do not ever touch me, Trent," I warned, my voice ringing with lethal clarity. Richard took a sudden step backward, his thick fingers loosening their grip on the heavy manila envelope. His dark eyes widened in total confusion and a sudden spike of primal fear. He looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. "What is wrong with you?" Richard demanded, his voice completely losing its confident rumble. "Did you not hear a single word I just said? I hold the power to completely destroy David, his entire reputation. I hold the power to ruin your life." Patricia stepped up beside him, her toxic smile vanishing entirely. "You are losing your mind, Beatrice." Patricia hissed, her voice shrill and panicked. "Your father is giving you a generous way out of a public scandal, and you are acting like a lunatic." I stared right back at them, my laughter fading into a cold, calculating smile. I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father, forcing him to retreat another inch. I was no longer the forgotten daughter, the family scapegoat, or the grieving widow they could easily manipulate. I was exactly the woman I had built myself to be. I stood tall, smoothing the lapels of my blazer, radiating an absolute untouchable power that made my parents shrink backward. "You are right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet hallway. "David did have a debt. But did you ever wonder how a broke IT worker like me managed to launch a $50 million cybersecurity firm?" I did not wait for my father to formulate an answer to my question. I turned my back on his stunned face and walked deliberately toward the massive digital display monitor mounted on the far wall of the courthouse lobby. The screen currently displayed the mundane daily docket of civil disputes and probate hearings. With a few rapid taps on my iPad screen, I overrode the public display system. The municipal schedule vanished instantly. In its place, a highly detailed, incredibly complex financial flowchart illuminated the dim corridor in sharp, high-definition resolution. The diagram was a sprawling web of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and silent holding companies. At the very center of the digital web sat Wilson Construction, the manufacturing and development empire Richard had spent his entire life building. I turned back to face my family, tapping my stylus against my screen to highlight the largest red node on the flowchart. "Look at the screen, Richard," I commanded, projecting my voice so it bounced off the cold marble pillars. "Force yourself to look at the reality of your situation." David did not embezzle a single cent from his tech firm. He liquidated every personal asset he had to his name. He cashed out his own retirement funds and leveraged his brilliant software patents to secure a massive high-risk offshore loan. He took on an astronomical amount of personal debt. And do you want to know exactly what he bought with all that capital? Richard stared up at the glowing monitor. His heavy jaw was slack. The aggressive purple flush of his skin had completely vanished, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. He tracked the digital lines flowing from the offshore loan directly into a blind proxy holding company. The exact same blind proxy holding company that had aggressively bailed out his failing construction firm 3 years ago. "For the past 3 years, you have been answering to an anonymous majority shareholder." I continued, stepping away from the screen and walking back toward the group. "You bragged to everyone at your country club about how your company was booming. You proudly took credit for the sudden influx of capital that saved Wilson Construction from total bankruptcy. You actually thought some faceless venture capital firm recognized your supposed business genius. You never bothered to dig into the proxy because you were too busy funneling your remaining cash into Trent, his fraudulent hedge fund, to care." "That is impossible!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking wildly. She stepped in front of Richard as if she could physically shield him from the glowing flowchart. You are a vicious liar, Beatrice. Your father built that company from the ground up with his bare hands. No faceless firm owns us. We are the majority. We control the board of directors. We control the assets. You control absolutely nothing, Patricia. I snapped back, slicing through her delusion. David saw exactly what Richard was doing. He saw Richard quietly draining the company revenue to cover up Trent, his massive trading losses. He saw the inevitable collapse approaching like a slow-moving train. David knew that when Wilson Construction finally went bankrupt, you and Richard would immediately come after me. You would demand I liquidate my own savings to save your lavish lifestyle. So David beat you to it. He used his massive loan to silently buy out the 60% controlling interest of your firm through that blind proxy. He effectively became your boss, and you never even knew it. Nia let out a low, sharp whistle. She crossed her arms, leaning against the wall and shaking her head in pure amazement. She looked at Trent, who was still clutching his slapped hand against his chest, and then back to Richard. You sold 60% of your family business to an anonymous buyer just to keep pumping cash into Trent, his illegal syndicate operation, Nia asked, her voice laced with absolute disgust. You literally sold your entire legacy to cover up his crimes. And you did not even do the basic due diligence to find out who you were selling it to. You are all completely incompetent. You deserve to lose everything. Richard could not tear his eyes away from the screen. He was physically shaking now. His thick hands trembled violently at his sides. He read the name of the holding company at the very top of the flowchart. It was the exact same holding company that owned the deed to my house. The exact same holding company that had provided the initial startup capital for my $50 million cybersecurity firm. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He gasped, grasping at his chest as his entire identity, his pride and his power were stripped away in real time. The man who had terrorized me my entire life was suddenly reduced to a trembling ruin. He had spent decades mocking David, calling him a broke IT worker, calling him a failure because he did not wear tailored suits or play golf with executives. And that same man had quietly bought his entire life. I walked right up to my father. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look away from the screen and look me dead in the eye. He was sweating profusely. The scent of stale cigars and pure terror radiated off him. David was protecting me. I whispered, my voice cold and hard as steel. He knew exactly what kind of vultures you all were. He built an impenetrable financial fortress around me, and he bought your entire livelihood to keep you on a tight leash. When he died, every single one of those shares transferred directly to me. The blind proxy dissolved today. I leaned in a fraction of an inch closer, watching the sheer panic dilate his pupils. I do not just own my company, Dad, I said, my voice echoing softly but clearly in the quiet hallway. I own yours. Richard shook his heavy head violently, causing his fleshy cheeks to tremble. He took a stumbling step backward, pointing a thick, shaking finger at the digital display monitor. You are bluffing, Beatrice. Richard snarled, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his panic. You fabricated this entire flowchart, just like you fabricated those digital metadata files. You do not have the capital, the intelligence, or the ruthlessness to orchestrate a hostile corporate takeover of my firm. I crossed my arms and offered him a tight, utterly merciless smile. Call Arthur, I suggested calmly, dropping the name of his longtime chief financial officer into the tense air. Go ahead, Dad. Call Arthur right now. Put him on speakerphone. Let us ask the man who actually runs your books if I am bluffing. Richard scrambled to pull his smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket. His thick fingers were visibly shaking as he fumbled with the screen, swiping aggressively until he found the contact. He tapped the screen and activated the speakerphone, holding the device out like a shield. The line rang twice, echoing loudly down the cold marble corridor. Arthur answered on the third ring. His voice sounded frantic, exhausted, and completely terrified. Richard Arthur blurted out instantly, not even waiting for a greeting. Thank God you are finally answering your phone. I have been trying to reach you all morning. We have a massive catastrophic situation at the firm. Richard swallowed hard, his face draining of whatever color it had left. What situation? Arthur Richard demanded, trying to maintain a facade of executive control. Tell me exactly what is going on. The blind proxy just dissolved. Richard Arthur explained, his voice trembling through the tiny speaker. The anonymous holding company that bailed us out 3 years ago just executed a sudden unmasking clause. They directly registered all their shares with the Securities and Exchange Commission 20 minutes ago. The proxy is gone. We have a known majority shareholder, and they just exercised their 60% voting rights to freeze all executive compensation accounts. You are locked out of the corporate funds, Richard. We all are. Patricia let out a sharp, horrified gasp, grabbing onto her husband, his arm for physical support. Richard stared at his phone, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. Who is the registered shareholder, Arthur? Richard finally choked out, praying for any other answer than the one he already knew was coming. Who owns the 60%? There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. It is your daughter, Richard, Arthur whispered, sounding completely defeated. Beatrice owns it. Her legal team just served us with formal notice of an emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning. She is initiating a total executive sweep. Richard, you do not own the company anymore. She does. I stepped forward and tapped the red button on the screen, abruptly ending the call. The silence that rushed back into the courthouse hallway was absolute and suffocating, the vulture's plea. The illusion of Richard, his untouchable power, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The aggressive, towering patriarch who had spent his entire life bullying, manipulating, and crushing anyone who stood in his way was gone. He suddenly looked like a very small, very pathetic old man. His broad shoulders slumped forward, and the malicious fire in his dark eyes was completely extinguished. Beatrice, please. Richard whimpered, his voice entirely stripped of its usual rumbling authority. He reached his hands out toward me, palms facing up in a desperate, pleading gesture. You cannot do this. You cannot take my life, his work. Wilson Construction is our family legacy. I built that company from the dirt. We are family, Beatrice. We share the same blood. You have to keep the business in the family. We can work this out privately. I will give you a seat on the board. I will give you whatever you want. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust wash over me. I slapped his extended hands away, mirroring the exact motion I had used on Trent earlier. Do not ever use the word family with me again, Richard. I commanded, my voice echoing off the stone walls like a judge delivering a final verdict. You just stood there 5 minutes ago and threatened to release a fabricated embezzlement file to the media. You explicitly told me David was a thief. You promised to drag his name through the absolute mud and ensure he went down in local history as a common fraud. You threatened to ruin the only thing I have left in this world, which is my dead husband, his legacy. And you did it all to steal my house. Richard backed away, trembling visibly as my words backed him into a corner. Patricia was weeping silently now, realizing her luxurious country club lifestyle was entirely finished. My husband gave his life building a safety net for me. I continued, stepping forward and forcing Richard to retreat further. David worked himself into an early grave, securing that offshore loan. He took on an astronomical amount of personal risk because he knew exactly what kind of people you are. He knew you vultures would come for my throat the second he was gone. He knew you would try to leave me destitute in the streets just to cover up your own financial crimes. David was 100 times the man you will ever be. He bought your company to make sure you could never touch me. The pathetic pivot. Richard clutched his chest with a thick, trembling hand. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He leaned heavily against the cold marble wall, sliding down slightly until his shoulder rested against a brass handrail. His authority was completely decimated. He was no longer the patriarch of the Wilson family. He was merely a minority shareholder, entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to destroy. Trent watched his father collapse against the wall. The golden boy realized his ultimate protector was gone. The endless supply of laundered money keeping his fraudulent hedge fund afloat had just vanished. But instead of showing an ounce of remorse or grasping the magnitude of the legal peril he was in, Trent, his selfish survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He pushed away from the wall, straightening his silk tie with frantic, jerky movements. He tried to pivot the entire conversation back to his own immediate survival. Okay, fine, Trent shouted, his voice cracking with desperate entitlement. Keep Dad's company, Beatrice. Take the whole thing. I do not care about the construction firm anyway. Just give me the house. Sign the deed over to me right now so Nia and I can cover our fund his margins before the market closes. If you have the construction company, you do not need the residential property. Just give me the house, Beatrice. Nia stared at her husband like he was a completely foreign, incredibly repulsive species of insect. She could not comprehend his sheer, absolute stupidity. I turned my head slowly, pulling my attention away from my broken father. I locked my eyes onto my brother. I let a cold, lethal silence build in the air before I addressed his pathetic demand. Trent was actually panting. The collar of his bespoke Italian shirt was damp with nervous sweat. He stared at me with wide, desperate eyes, genuinely believing that after everything I had just revealed, I would simply hand over my property to save his miserable skin. His sheer entitlement was staggering. He was a drowning man demanding I give him my lifeboat so he could continue sinking. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I simply lifted the silver iPad that rested in my palm. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I swiped my finger across the glass screen. The massive digital monitor mounted on the lobby wall instantly shifted. The complex corporate flowchart vanished. In its place, a singular, highly classified financial document appeared in stark high definition. Blazoned across the top of the ledger in massive crimson letters was a single word: default. Trent physically recoiled as if the screen had just struck him. All the remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. Let us talk about your margins, Trent. I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost pleasant register that made my mother shudder. Let us talk about the absolute fiction you call a hedge fund. You do not manage wealth, Trent. You destroy it. Your fund did not just suffer a bad quarter. You have not made a legitimate, successful trade in over 2 years. You shut your mouth, Trent hissed, taking a step forward before Nia grabbed the back of his jacket and yanked him backward. You do not understand high-level finance, Beatrice. You do not know how the market fluctuates. I know exactly how a localized Ponzi scheme operates, I countered, stepping directly into his line of sight. I know that when your initial investments cratered, you panicked. You started taking in new capital from your country club buddies, your wife, her trust fund, and our father just to pay fake dividends to your early investors. You needed to create the illusion of profitability to keep the cash flowing. But you did not reinvest that new capital into stable equities, did you, Trent? Trent swallowed so hard his apple bobbed visibly. He shook his head in silent, frantic denial. You took millions of dollars of stolen money and dumped it into leveraged crypto gambling, I said, projecting my voice so every syllable hit him like a hammer. You chased volatile digital coins trying to win back your losses overnight. You gambled away Nia her clean inheritance on internet meme coins, and when the market inevitably crashed, it completely wiped you out. Nia let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She shoved Trent hard in the back, sending him stumbling forward. You lost my grandfather, his money on crypto, Nia yelled, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. You promised me you placed it in municipal bonds. You swore it was safe. It was a temporary dip, Trent pleaded, turning to his furious wife. I just needed liquidity to ride out the margin calls. I had a strategy, Nia. Your strategy was begging our father for a bailout, I interrupted smoothly, drawing his terrified gaze back to me. I tapped the iPad screen again. A bank transfer receipt appeared next to the default notice. $500,000 wired directly from Richard his personal accounts to Trent his shell corporation. Patricia found her voice again, stepping forward to defend her golden boy. There is nothing illegal about a father helping his son, Patricia said, her chin trembling with forced defiance. Your father gave Trent an investment. He believed in his boy. That is what real families do, Beatrice. They support each other. He did not give him an investment, Patricia, I replied, shaking my head with cold pity. He gave him a desperate bailout, a bailout that Trent instantly blew. He burned through that $500,000 in exactly 48 hours, trying to cover a massive margin call. The money evaporated. It is gone. And when that money vanished, Trent was backed into a corner. Traditional banks would not even look at him. His credit was destroyed. The federal regulators were already sniffing around his suspicious trading patterns. He needed millions of dollars of immediate liquid cash, or he was going straight to federal prison. Trent dropped to his knees. He literally collapsed onto the hard floor, wrapping his arms around his stomach as if he were going to be sick. "Please, Beatrice," he begged, tears finally spilling over his cheeks. "Stop talking. Just stop talking." "But you found a solution. Did you not, Trent?" I continued, circling him like a predator examining wounded prey. "You found a shadow lender, a predatory private equity firm willing to hand you a high-interest bridge loan, no questions asked. But predatory lenders do not just hand over millions in cash without collateral. They needed a hard physical asset to secure the loan." Richard, who had been leaning silently against the wall, suddenly pushed himself upright. A new, terrifying realization dawned in his dark eyes. "Trent?" Richard growled, his voice dangerous and low. "What did you use for collateral?" Trent just sobbed, rocking back and forth on his knees. I tapped my stylus against the iPad. A copy of a property deed appeared on the massive monitor. It was not the deed to my house. "He used your house, Richard," I said, delivering the crushing blow with absolute precision. "He forged your signature on a secondary mortgage application. He put your primary mansion, the pristine suburban palace where you and Patricia sleep every single night, on the line to secure his shadow loan. You do not own your home anymore, Dad. The bank does not own it either." Patricia let out a piercing shriek. Her knees buckled, and Richard had to catch her by the arm to prevent her from hitting the floor. "You put my house up for collateral." Patricia screamed at her son, her carefully maintained upper-class facade completely disintegrating. "You stole my home." "He did not just steal it, Patricia," I corrected her, my voice slicing through her hysterics. "He lost it. He defaulted on the shadow loan. The lender called the debt in full last Tuesday. Trent had absolutely zero liquidity to pay them back. That is why he forged the deed to my property. That is why you all dragged me to this courthouse today. He needed to steal my house, sell it for cash, and pay off the shadow lender before they seized your mansion. He was trying to rob his widowed sister to save his own skin." Nia took a slow, deliberate step away from Trent. Her sharp, brilliant legal mind was racing. She looked at the crimson default notice on the screen. She looked at the forged signatures. She looked at my calm, untouchable posture. She processed the timeline of the loan, the sudden foreclosure threat, and the fact that I somehow possessed all of these highly classified financial documents. Nia gasped. Her hands flew to cover her mouth. She pieced it together before anyone else in the room. She stared at me, her eyes wide, with a mixture of absolute horror and profound, undeniable respect. "You bought the debt," Nia whispered, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the lobby. "You are the shadow lender." "Exactly," I said, turning my gaze back to my sister-in-law. I offered her a single sharp nod of confirmation. "You are the only one in this family with any actual business sense, Nia." I reached into my tailored leather bag one final time. My fingers brushed past the encrypted flash drive I had displayed earlier and closed around a thick stack of heavy legal parchment. I pulled out the actual notarized deed to Richard and Patricia, their sprawling suburban mansion. I held it up high, letting the harsh overhead fluorescent lights catch the raised gold seal of the county clerk. The thick, high-quality paper felt incredibly satisfying in my grip. It was the physical manifestation of my ultimate leverage. It was the culmination of years of quiet, strategic planning and relentless execution. I stepped right past Trent, who was still kneeling on the floor, rocking back and forth like a broken child. I stopped directly in front of my parents. The sheer terror in their eyes was intoxicating. "You stood in that mediation room less than an hour ago and threatened to make me homeless," I said, my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of pity. "You promised to strip away my sanctuary, to take the home David and I built together brick by brick. You looked me dead in the eye and offered me a pathetic $2,000 to go live in a cramped studio apartment while you planned to sell my property to cover Trent his massive gambling debts. You thought you could just discard me the way you always have. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but I immediately silenced him with a sharp gesture of the deed. You thought you held all the cards? Because you have always held all the cards. I continued stepping closer until I could see the sweat beading on Richard his forehead. Ever since I was a teenager, you used your wealth as a weapon to force my compliance. You paid for Trent, his luxury cars, his European vacations, and his elite private university, while you forced me to take out crippling loans just to attend a state college. You told me I had to earn my keep while you handed him a golden ticket. You explicitly told me I would never succeed in the business world because I was too soft, too emotional. I snapped the heavy parchment sharply between my fingers. The loud crack made both of them jump. Well, I earned my keep, Richard. I stated my words, slicing through the heavy air. I earned it so well that when your golden boy defaulted on his shadow loan, I was the one who bought your debt for pennies on the dollar. The holding company did not just absorb your construction firm. They absorbed all the collateral tied to Trent his margin calls. I took one final step forward, closing the distance completely. You do not own your house anymore, Richard, I said, enunciating every single syllable with lethal precision. The bank does not own it either. As of Friday morning, the deed officially transferred to my holding company. I am your landlord. Patricia let out a guttural, high-pitched scream that ripped through the quiet courthouse lobby. It was a raw, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. Her pristine, perfectly manicured facade completely shattered in an instant. The elegant society matriarch vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate woman. She lunged forward, her manicured hands hooked into claws, aiming straight for the legal documents in my hand. She wanted to tear the deed to shreds, as if destroying the paper would somehow reverse the reality of her total ruin. Trent scrambled up from the floor, moving purely on adrenaline and panic. He grabbed his mother by the shoulders, wrapping his arms around her waist and hauling her backward. Patricia thrashed wildly against his grip, her expensive heels slipping dangerously on the polished marble. "Let me go!" Patricia shrieked, her voice hoarse and frantic. She kicked at her son, her carefully styled hair coming completely undone. "She stole our home. She stole my life. Get it back, Trent. Get it back right now." I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still, holding the deed out of her reach, watching the woman who had tormented me for 34 years completely unravel. Patricia was hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved violently as the reality of her situation finally breached her monumental delusion. She realized that her entire country club socialite life, her charity galas, her lavish garden parties, her absolute superiority over her friends, was all a massive mirage. And worse, it was a mirage entirely owned and controlled by the daughter she had always despised. "All those charity luncheons you hosted, Patricia?" I said, my tone conversational but loud enough to pierce her hysterics. "All those times you bragged to your wealthy friends about your brilliant hedge fund son and your incredibly successful husband. How long do you think it will take for the country club gossip to spread? How long until they find out your son is a total fraud, your husband is facing federal money laundering charges, and you live in a house owned by the daughter you spent your entire life mocking and treating like a servant?" The fight completely drained out of her. Trent let go of her shoulders and she immediately collapsed. Her knees hit the hard marble floor with a dull, heavy thud. Her designer skirt pooled around her and she slumped forward. The woman who had spent my entire childhood demanding perfection, demanding absolute obedience, and constantly pointing out every tiny flaw I possessed, was now groveling on the floor of a municipal building. She slowly looked up at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swimming with tears. But I knew my mother better than anyone. I knew every manipulative trick in her extensive emotional arsenal. I recognized the subtle shift in her expression. The tears were completely fake. It was a highly calculated performance, a desperate attempt to pivot from violent rage to helpless victimhood. She thought she could weaponize my empathy the same way she always had. "We raised you, Patricia!" sobbed her voice, trembling with manufactured heartbreak. She reached out a shaking hand, grabbing the bottom hem of my blazer, pulling gently like a frightened child. "We gave you everything, Beatrice. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We clothed you. We loved you. You are our flesh and blood. You cannot do this to your own family. You cannot put your own mother on the street." I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. Patricia was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Her shoulders heaved with exaggerated theatrical sobs, and she reached out her perfectly manicured hands, grasping blindly at the empty air between us. She expected me to break. She fully anticipated that 34 years of ingrained psychological obedience would automatically kick in. She thought I would immediately drop to my knees, wrap my arms around her trembling frame, and desperately apologize for causing her so much distress. She believed the spectacle of a wealthy socialite crying on the cold marble floor of a municipal building would shame me into submission. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my posture completely rigid, my hands casually resting at my sides, holding the heavy manila envelope and my silver tablet. I stared down at her flawless salon blowout and her quivering designer shoulders. The stone floor offered her absolutely no comfort, and I offered her even less. Patricia realized the silence stretching above her was entirely devoid of sympathy. She snapped her head up, her expensive waterproof mascara perfectly intact, despite the supposedly hysterical crying. Her eyes widened, searching my face for the familiar, compliant daughter she had spent decades meticulously molding. When she found absolutely nothing but cold, detached amusement, her tactics instantly escalated. The victim routine morphed seamlessly into righteous indignation. "I stayed up nights with you when you were sick," Patricia wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "I gave up my youth for you, Beatrice. I sacrificed my body, my promising career, my entire social standing to give you ungrateful children a perfect home. I spent my best years making sure you had every advantage in life. I gave you everything a mother could possibly give, and this is how you repay me. You are a cold, heartless monster trying to throw the woman who gave you life out onto the street." I let her words hang in the heavy air, allowing the sheer audacity of her martyrdom to fully saturate the space around us. Richard was still slumped against the brass handrail, breathing heavily and staring blankly at his polished shoes. Trent was hovering uselessly behind his mother, shifting his weight from foot to foot, completely paralyzed by his own financial ruin. Nia was watching me with an expression of quiet awe, absorbing the masterclass in psychological warfare. "You stayed up nights with me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost clinical whisper. "That is a fascinating historical revision, Patricia. Let us talk about your legendary maternal sacrifices. Let us talk about the time I was 16. I had double pneumonia and a fever of 104. I could barely draw breath into my lungs. You drove me to the emergency room at Boston. General dropped me at the triage desk and drove away before the nurse even took my vitals." Patricia flinched, her fake tears momentarily pausing as genuine defensive panic crossed her features. "I had to go," Patricia stammered, her tone instantly losing its wounded tremor. "Trent had his junior invitational golf tournament. He needed me there for moral support. He needed you to ride in the luxury golf cart and drink mimosas with the country club wives," I corrected smoothly, stepping half an inch closer. "You left your teenage daughter struggling to breathe alone in a sterile hospital corridor because you absolutely refused to miss a high society networking event." I sat in a plastic chair, shivering for 6 hours until a social worker finally called a cab to bring me home. "And as for giving up your youth," I continued, slicing through her next anticipated excuse before she could even form it. "You have spent my entire life violently competing with me for attention. You could never let me have a single day of joy without ensuring you remained the absolute center of the universe. You literally wore a floor-length white lace gown to my wedding. You physically shoved me out of the way during the reception line, just to ensure every single one of his tech colleagues looked at you instead of the bride. You spent the entire evening complaining to the caterers that the vintage champagne was too dry while I tried to dance with my husband. You are twisting things. Patricia hissed, her voice dropping the victim act entirely and regaining its familiar venomous edge. It was an ivory dress, and it was highly appropriate for a summer ceremony. You have always been insanely jealous of me, Beatrice. You have always tried to make me look like a villain to cover up your own deep insecurities. I smiled a terrifyingly bright smile that made Trent take a physical step backward in pure self-preservation. Let us talk about the ultimate proof of your motherly love, I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. Let us talk about David, his funeral. Patricia froze. Her mouth snapped shut and the remaining color completely drained from her face. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze, staring instead at the edge of my tailored slacks. The man I loved was lowered into the frozen ground. 3 months ago, I said, enunciating every word so clearly it felt like physical strikes landing in the quiet room. My entire world was shattered. I was standing by an open grave, completely destroyed. And you did not even show up. You told Aunt Sarah you were far too distressed by the light drizzle. You skipped my husband his funeral because you did not want the humidity to ruin your expensive blowout. You did not call me. You did not visit. You waited exactly 2 weeks, and then you started aggressively demanding I sell my house to cover Trent his margin calls. Richard closed his eyes tightly, turning his face further toward the wall. Even he knew there was absolutely no defending that particular truth. Trent stared at the floor, completely silent. Nia shook her head in sheer disgust, crossing her arms tighter over her chest and looking at her mother-in-law with utter revulsion. Patricia, her entire performance collapsed. She was kneeling on the hard floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her fake reality. The rich socialite facade was entirely stripped away, leaving only a selfish, bitter woman who had finally run out of leverage. She glared up at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. She hated me because I had survived her. She hated me because I had outsmarted them all. But mostly she hated me because I now owned the ground she stood on. I crouched down smoothly, bending my knees until my face was perfectly level with hers. The scent of her cloying floral perfume was suffocating, but I did not pull away. I looked directly into her venomous eyes, holding her gaze with absolute authority. "You didn't raise a daughter, Patricia," I whispered, my voice a deadly, absolute certainty. "You raised a punching bag. But the punching bag just bought the gym." I stood up slowly, towering over the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. Patricia stopped her fake crying instantly. The absolute finality in my voice stripped away her last remaining delusion. She stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the obedient daughter she thought she could control was gone forever. I stepped back, smoothing the lapels of my blazer, and turned my attention to the remaining pieces of the Wilson family legacy scattered across the courthouse lobby. Trent was still on his knees, but he was no longer looking at me. His frantic, bloodshot eyes were darting wildly around the room, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He looked at his father, seeking the usual bailout, the immediate blank check that had magically erased every mistake he had ever made since childhood. But Richard was staring at the floor, a hollow, broken shell of a man who suddenly realized his empire was a mountain of dust. The bank of Dad was permanently closed. Trent shifted his desperate gaze to the only lifeline he had left. Nia had been standing remarkably still throughout my entire presentation. She was a woman born into generational wealth and raised in the cutthroat world of corporate litigation. While Patricia screamed and Richard shut down, Nia had been silently calculating the math of this entire bloodbath. I watched her dark, intelligent eyes scan the digital monitor, processing the default notices, the forged secondary mortgage, and the catastrophic margin calls. She was running the numbers, assessing the collateral damage, and determining her exact proximity to the blast zone. Nia looked at the crushed, pathetic figure of her husband groveling on the marble floor. She looked at the forged federal documents displayed on my screen. Then she looked directly at me. In that split second, an unspoken understanding passed between us. Nia recognized an apex predator, and she knew better than to stand between a predator and its prey. She took a slow, deliberate step away from Trent, as if he were highly contagious. Her posture stiffened and her beautiful face smoothed into a mask of pure, cold pragmatism. Trent scrambled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out desperately to grab the hem of her designer skirt. "Naya," he pleaded, his voice cracking with panicked entitlement. "Naya, babe, do not look at me like that. We can fix this. We just need to hire a restructuring firm. We can move some of your trust fund capital around to satisfy the immediate debt. My parents will help. We will get a legal team and fight her for the property." Nia looked down at his trembling, outstretched hand. Her expression was a mixture of absolute disgust and profound exhaustion. She swung her arm and slapped his hand away with a sharp, violent crack that echoed loudly through the lobby. Trent fell backward, landing hard on his elbows, staring up at his wife in pure shock. With what money Trent, Nia demanded, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. She gestured sharply toward Richard and Patricia. "Look at them. Your parents cannot help you. Your sister owns their house, their company, and your debt. Your entire family is financially radioactive. There is no restructuring firm on this planet that can fix a federal crime." Trent shook his head frantically. "It is just a misunderstanding with the proxy lender," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It is a civil matter, Nia. It is just business." "It is wire fraud," Nia corrected him, her voice dropping an octave, wrapping around him like a noose. "It is felony embezzlement, and it is incredibly sloppy forgery. I saw the IP address timestamp on Beatrice, her screen. I recognize that specific network address. You did not just forge your father his signature on a secondary mortgage. You forged a federal document in your mistress her bed." Patricia gasped, clutching her chest, but Nia ignored her completely, keeping her lethal gaze locked onto her husband. Trent opened his mouth to deny it, but the words died in his throat. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "You actually thought I did not know about Jessica?" Nia asked, tilting her head with a terrifyingly calm smile. "You thought you were so clever renting that luxury condo under a shell corporation. You are a terrible liar, Trent. And you are an even worse hedge fund manager. I tolerated your pathetic infidelity because our marriage was a useful business arrangement. But I draw the line at federal prison. I am a lot of things, Trent, but I am not going to jail for a broke loser." Trent let out a pathetic, whimpering sound, reaching for her ankle. "Nia, please. You are my wife." Nia took another step backward, completely out of his reach. She raised her left hand, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent lights. The massive 4-carat diamond engagement ring Trent had given her sparkled brilliantly. It was a ring purchased with her own family money, naturally, because Trent had completely blown his annual bonus on crypto gambling weeks before he proposed. With one smooth, effortless motion, Nia slipped the heavy diamond off her finger. Trent watched in paralyzed horror as the ultimate symbol of his fabricated success was removed. Nia looked at the ring for a fraction of a second before dropping it directly into Trent, his open shirt pocket. The heavy platinum band hit his chest with a dull final thud. "Keep it," Nia said, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. "You are going to need it to pay your defense attorney." Trent crumpled forward, pressing his forehead against the cold marble floor, letting out a long, broken sob. His mother was homeless, his father was ruined, his career was over, and his wealthy wife had just discarded him like a piece of worthless trash. The golden boy of the Wilson family was completely annihilated. Nia did not waste another second looking at the wreckage of her marriage. She smoothed her immaculate skirt, stepped over Trent, his trembling legs, and turned to face me. The transition from betrayed wife to ruthless businesswoman was seamless and terrifyingly efficient. She walked right up to me, stopping just outside my personal space. "You want to destroy him entirely?" Nia stated, a business-like proposition framing her words. "You want to ensure he never recovers from this?" I held her gaze, matching her cold intensity. "I want him to face the exact consequences of his actions," I replied. "I want my grandfather, his initial capital returned before the federal investigators freeze Trent his accounts." Nia countered, her eyes burning with sharp intelligence. "Trent is stupid, but he is also a coward. He panicked when the market crashed. I know for a fact he hid a small reserve of liquid assets in an offshore account in the Caymans. He thinks it is untraceable." If you help me recover my family money before the shadow lender seizes his entire portfolio, I will give you the routing numbers. I will give you the passwords. I will hand you the exact digital trail you need to put him in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. We can help each other, Beatrice. I stared at the woman standing before me, the chaotic symphony of Patricia weeping on the floor and Trent hyperventilating nearby faded into meaningless white noise. Nia and I were locked in a completely different frequency. Just 20 minutes ago, we were at each other her throats. She had walked into this courthouse fully prepared to watch me lose my home and my dignity. But now the dynamic had violently shifted. We were no longer enemies. We were simply two women negotiating the terms of a brutal surrender. Nia did not flinch under my gaze. I had to respect her sheer audacity. While the Wilson bloodline crumbled into a pathetic puddle of panic and despair, this woman who had married into their mess was actively calculating her extraction strategy. She was a survivor. A highly selfish, incredibly ruthless survivor, but a survivor nonetheless. She recognized that the ship was not just sinking, it was already resting at the bottom of the ocean. She was simply securing the last remaining life vest before the water crushed her lungs. Let us be entirely transparent, Beatrice, Nia said, her voice crisp and echoing slightly against the marble pillars. You have the financial records. You have the digital footprint. You can absolutely destroy Trent and Richard on paper. But federal fraud cases take years. They drag through the courts. Richard has political connections. He will hire expensive defense attorneys to stall the proceedings. He will try to muddy the waters and claim ignorance. He will drag you through depositions and exhausting discovery phases until you are drained of your resources. I remained perfectly still, letting her make her pitch. She was not wrong. But I can hand you the silver bullet. Nia continued, stepping half an inch closer, her dark eyes burning with sharp intelligence. I can give you the one piece of evidence that bypasses years of litigation. I was in the room when Trent and Richard drafted the fake will. I was there when they conspired to manipulate David, his offshore accounts. They explicitly coerced me into notarizing the fraudulent documents that triggered this entire mess. They threatened to cut off my access to our joint accounts if I did not comply. I have text messages. I have emails. I have dates and timestamps. Trent let out a strangled gasp from his position on the floor. Nia, you cannot do this, he pleaded, his voice raw and broken. You are my wife. We have spousal privilege. They cannot force you to testify against me. Nia did not even glance down at him. Spousal privilege only protects confidential communications. Trent, she stated, her tone dripping with academic disdain. It does not apply when spouses jointly participate in an ongoing criminal enterprise. You should have paid more attention in your business ethics seminars instead of trading cryptocurrency in the middle of the night. She locked her gaze back onto mine. Her proposition was crystal clear. If you need a star witness to testify that Trent and Richard coerced me into signing that fake will, my legal team will provide the fully executed affidavit by 5 o'clock this evening, Nia offered smoothly. I will give the federal prosecutors everything they need to secure a grand jury indictment by Monday morning. I will hand you their heads on a silver platter, Beatrice. And what exactly do you want in exchange? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Nia lifted her chin, holding her ground. In exchange, you do not name me in the federal fraud suit. You instruct your legal counsel to classify me as a cooperating witness rather than a co-conspirator. You grant me absolute civil immunity from the financial fallout of your holding company. I walk away completely clean with my grandfather, his capital intact. You get your ultimate revenge, and I get my life back. I studied the woman standing opposite me. Nia was cold, calculating, and entirely self-serving. She had been perfectly willing to watch me burn when she thought she was on the winning side. But I also recognized a fellow victim of the Wilson family toxicity. The moment Trent became a liability, he dragged her down with him, gambling away her inheritance and exposing her to federal prosecution. She was cutting the dead weight. She was making a ruthless business decision, and I could not fault the logic. With her affidavit, Trent and Richard would have absolutely zero legal defense. The holding company would consume their physical assets, and the federal government would consume their freedom. It was the perfect, efficient execution I required. I let a slow, tight smile spread across my face. Deal, I said, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a binding contract. Have your attorneys send the affidavit directly to Arthur by 5 o'clock. If the file is 1 minute late, all bets are off, and you go down with them. Naya visibly relaxed her posture, losing a fraction of its rigid tension. She offered a single curt nod of agreement. Done, she said. She turned on her heel, preparing to walk out of the courthouse and leave the wreckage of the Wilson family behind her forever. And Nia, I called out, my voice stopping her dead in her tracks. She turned back, looking at me with a flicker of sudden apprehension. Leave the Birkin bag, I commanded, gesturing toward the pristine, extremely rare Himalayan crocodile purse clutched in her right hand. Nia frowned, clutching the handle slightly tighter. Beatrice, this is my personal property. It was an anniversary gift. It was not a gift, Nia. I corrected, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. Trent paid for that $20,000 bag using the stolen deposit from my husband, his life insurance payout. He wired the funds exactly 3 days after David died. That bag belongs to me. Leave it. Trent let out another pathetic sob, curling tighter into a ball on the floor. Richard covered his face with his hands, unable to watch the absolute, systematic dismantling of his empire. Patricia was still hyperventilating, her fake tears having morphed into genuine terror as she realized the true extent of the financial crimes her son had committed. Nia looked at the incredibly expensive bag in her hands. She looked at Trent groveling on the floor. The calculation in her eyes was swift and brutal. She recognized that holding on to a stolen luxury item was simply not worth risking her federal immunity. Without a single word of protest, Nia walked over to a polished wooden bench near the lobby entrance. She gracefully unclasped the silver hardware and tipped the bag upside down. She emptied her designer wallet, her keys, her lipstick, and her smartphone directly onto the hard wood. The contents clattered loudly in the quiet space. She picked up the empty $20,000 purse, walked back over to me, and handed it over. I took the bag, slipping it smoothly onto my forearm. A pleasure doing business with you, Beatrice, Nia said, her voice completely steady. She turned around, gathered her loose belongings from the bench, and walked out through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. She did not look back, not once. She did not cast a single glance at the man she had married or the family she had married into. She simply walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, leaving the nightmare entirely behind her. Trent was left completely alone on the cold marble floor. His golden boy status, his wealth, his arrogant smirk, and his ruthless wife were all gone. He was nothing but a broken, bankrupt criminal waiting for the authorities to arrive. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind Nia, sealing the silence inside the vast courthouse lobby. The sharp echo of her designer heels faded into the distance, leaving a profound, suffocating stillness in its wake. The grand architecture of the municipal building, with its soaring ceilings and imposing marble pillars, suddenly felt like a massive stone tomb. I stood motionless, holding the empty crocodile leather handbag over my forearm, feeling its heavy weight against my skin. It was a tangible trophy of absolute conquest, a $20,000 symbol of the greed that had finally destroyed them. I slowly turned my attention to the 3 people remaining in the room. The great Wilson family, the untouchable dynasty of Boston high society, was entirely broken. Richard was leaning heavily against a thick marble column. His chest heaved erratically as he gasped for air, his face a pale, sickly gray. He was hyperventilating, his hands clutching his chest as the reality of absolute financial ruin crushed his lungs. The man who had spent decades dictating corporate policy and terrifying his subordinates was now struggling to draw a single steady breath. Patricia was sitting on a wooden bench nearby. Her theatrical weeping had vanished entirely, replaced by silent leaking tears that ruined her expensive waterproof makeup. She stared blankly at the wall, finally comprehending that her elite socialite status had been permanently revoked. She was silently calculating the sheer humiliation of facing her country club friends, knowing she was completely destitute. And Trent. Trent was just a hollow shell staring vacantly at the geometric patterns on the marble floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. I reached into the sleek leather portfolio tucked under my arm and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents clipped securely together. The sharp sound of the rustling paper made Richard flinch as if he had been physically struck. I walked toward him, my footsteps echoing deliberately in the empty space. I stopped exactly 2 feet away, forcing him to look at me. He raised his heavy head, his eyes bloodshot and defeated. I held out the stack of papers. He did not reach for them, so I dropped them directly onto his lap. "Those are your formal eviction notices," I stated, my voice echoing with clinical precision. "I own the Beacon Hill estate, Richard. I own the mortgage, and as of this morning, I own the deed. You have exactly 72 hours to pack up your personal belongings and vacate my property." Patricia let out a strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Richard stared at the legal seal on the front page, his hands shaking violently. 72 hours, Beatrice, he managed to whisper, his voice raspy and weak. "We have lived in that house for 30 years. You cannot expect us to pack 3 decades of our lives in 3 days. I expect you to leave," I corrected smoothly, stepping closer so he could see the absolute zero in my eyes. "You will take your personal garments and nothing else. You will leave the antique furniture. You will leave the artwork. You will leave the silver sets and the crystal chandeliers. If a single light fixture is missing, if one piece of baseboard is damaged, if you attempt to strip the copper wiring or take appliances out of spite, I will immediately press felony vandalism charges against both of you. You will walk out of that house with exactly what you brought into this world. Nothing." The absolute finality of my words finally pierced through Trent, his state of shock. The thick fog in his eyes cleared entirely, replaced by a frantic, feral panic. He scrambled up from the floor, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and stained with cold sweat. He stumbled toward me, closing the distance between us with desperate, jerky movements. He looked like a cornered animal, completely stripped of his usual arrogant swagger. "Beatrice, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. He reached out as if to grab my shoulders, but thought better of it, dropping his hands awkwardly to his sides. "Beatrice, please, I am your brother. We grew up together. We share the same blood. They will send me to federal prison for the DocuSign forgery. You cannot let them lock me up." I watched him sweat, finding it absolutely fascinating how quickly he remembered our biological connection. "You were not my brother when you stole my husband his life insurance money," I reminded him, my tone conversational but razor sharp. "You were not my brother when you forged my signature to leverage my assets. You were just a parasite feeding off my grief." "But Nia is going to send the affidavit," Trent babbled, saliva gathering at the corners of his mouth. "The federal prosecutors are going to see the documents. They are going to see the wire transfers to the offshore accounts. They will send me to a maximum security federal prison, Beatrice. I am a hedge fund manager. I will not survive in there. You know I will not survive. You have to tell your lawyers to drop the suit. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. You cannot let them lock me up." He dropped to his knees again, practically groveling at the toes of my boots. He was weeping openly now, his face red and blotchy, completely abandoning any shred of human dignity. He was a pathetic coward, begging the sister he had tormented for decades to magically erase his own criminal actions. I looked down at Trent, my face utterly void of pity. I felt absolutely nothing for the man weeping at my feet. No anger, no sadness, just a profound, sweeping emptiness. I stepped back, creating physical distance between myself and the wreckage of his life. "I am not sending you to prison, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that echoed perfectly in the silent lobby. "Your own greed is." He let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying his face in his hands. I turned away from him, dismissing his existence entirely. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face, casting a harsh glow in the dimming afternoon light. I unlocked the device and pulled up the direct line to my lead federal attorney. It was time to make the call. I held my phone flat in the palm of my hand and pressed the green call button, tapping the speaker icon immediately after. The digital dial tone echoed sharply, bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings and the cold stone walls. 1 ring, 2 rings. The rhythmic sound commanded the complete attention of everyone left in the lobby. Richard stopped hyperventilating long enough to stare at the device with a look of pure dread. Patricia wiped her ruined makeup, holding her breath as if making a sound would trigger a bomb. Trent remained frozen on the floor, his eyes glued to the glowing screen, like a man awaiting his execution. Special Agent Miller. Go ahead, Beatrice. The voice answering the call was sharp, metallic, and carried the unmistakable heavy weight of federal authority. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders and ending lives with a single signature. The words, "Special Agent," hit the remaining members of the Wilson family like a physical shockwave. Richard stumbled backward, hitting the solid marble column with a heavy, sickening thud. His jaw went completely slack. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her hands flying to her throat as if she were actively choking. They suddenly realized the absolute staggering magnitude of the trap they had walked into. I had not just brought a corporate lawyer to a family dispute. I had brought the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had them on standby this entire time, waiting patiently while the Wilsons dug their own graves right outside the probate court doors. Agent Miller. The trap is completely closed, I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level and clinical. Trent Wilson just officially filed the secondary mortgage and the revised will with the probate clerk. The documents have been submitted into the county record and time-stamped. Understood, Beatrice. The agent replied, the sound of keyboard clacking audible in the background. That constitutes the final execution of wire fraud across state lines. We have the electronic trail from the proxy lender, we have the offshore routing numbers, and we now have the physical submission of forged federal documents. Nia is also providing a sworn affidavit by 5:00 this evening, I added, looking directly at Trent, who was now physically shaking. She is confirming coercion and admitting to witnessing the forgery firsthand. You have everything you need to proceed with the grand jury indictment. Excellent work, Beatrice, Agent Miller said, his tone turning brisk and highly tactical. You can step down now. We are moving in immediately. I have a digital forensics strike team currently breaching the lobby of the luxury condo downtown. We are seizing all laptops, hard drives, and physical documents from the mistress, her residence. The operation is officially a go. I ended the call, letting the silence slam back into the room. The specific mention of Jessica, her apartment, broke Trent entirely. The final remaining illusion that he could somehow talk his way out of this or hire a smooth defense attorney to muddy the waters evaporated in an instant. The FBI was not just looking at paperwork in a distant office. They were physically kicking down the door of his secret life. They were actively seizing the very computers he had used to forge his father, his signature. There was no spin. There was no proxy lender to blame. It was a direct targeted federal raid. Trent let out a sound that was half scream and half whimper, a pathetic animalistic noise that echoed horribly in the grand space. He scrambled to his feet, his expensive custom-tailored suit completely ruined. His Italian leather shoes slipped wildly on the polished marble as he fought for traction. He did not look at me. He did not look at his father, who was clutching his chest in agony. He did not look at the mother who had worshipped the ground he walked on since the day he was born. Trent turned and bolted. He ran down the long, grand hallway of the courthouse, pushing past a heavy oak door and sprinting toward the rear exit. His panicked, erratic footsteps echoed frantically, bouncing off the walls and fading into the distance as he fled the building. He shoved a security guard out of the way, knocking over a velvet stanchion in his desperate, blind terror. He was running entirely on adrenaline and cowardice, leaving his elderly parents behind to face the catastrophic ruin he had engineered. I turned my head slowly to look at Richard and Patricia. They were standing side by side, frozen in place, staring down the long, empty corridor where their golden boy had just disappeared. The realization washed over them, painting their aging faces with profound, sickening clarity. The son they had sacrificed everything for, the son they had protected, enabled, and funded at my expense, had not even paused to help them up from the floor. He was not going to stay and fight. He was not going to hire a legal team to protect the family name. He had abandoned them to face the crushing federal consequences of his greed while he ran away like an absolute coward. Patricia slowly lowered her hands from her throat. Her lips trembled as she stared at the swinging wooden doors at the end of the hall. The reality of her entire existence, the absolute failure of her parenting, was staring her right in the face. I adjusted the heavy crocodile leather handbag on my arm and smoothed the front of my blazer. I had taken their home. I had taken their company. I had taken their wealth. But Trent running away had taken the only thing they actually valued. I did not say a single word. I simply watched them break. The heavy glass doors at the end of the corridor had long since swung shut, but the frantic echoing slap of Trent, his leather shoes against the marble floor, still seemed to vibrate in the air. The silence that rushed in to fill the void left by his cowardly escape was absolute and suffocating. I stood perfectly still, holding the Birkin bag over my arm, and watched the exact moment the grand illusion of the Wilson family finally died. Richard and Patricia remained completely frozen, staring down the empty hallway where their golden boy had just disappeared. They were statues of grief and shock, trapped in a nightmare they had spent 3 decades meticulously building. I watched the realization wash over them, painting their aging faces with a profound, sickening clarity. The son they had sacrificed everything for, the son they had protected, enabled, and funded at my expense, had not even paused to help them up from the floor. He was not going to stay and fight. He was not going to hire a legal team to protect the family name. He had abandoned them to face the crushing federal consequences of his greed while he ran away to save his own skin. Patricia slowly lowered her hands from her throat. Her lips trembled as she stared at the swinging wooden doors. The reality of her entire existence, the absolute failure of her parenting, was staring her right in the face. She had spent her entire life curating a perfect social image, brushing every one of his failures under the rug and blaming me for any crack in the facade. Now the facade was not just cracked, it was pulverized. Richard slowly turned his head away from the empty corridor. His face was a mask of gray defeat, a sickly ashen color that highlighted every deep wrinkle and fold of skin. He looked like a man who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. His chest heaved erratically as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. But as his bloodshot eyes finally found mine, a familiar bitter spark ignited in his pupils. He could not process his own failure. His massive ego simply would not allow him to accept that he had groomed a criminal and destroyed his own empire. So he instinctively did what he had done for 34 years. He blamed me. Richard pushed himself off the marble pillar with a trembling groan. He took a shaky, unstable step in my direction. He tried to pull his shoulders back, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former corporate authority. It was a pathetic sight. A ruined king without a kingdom trying to command the executioner who had just dropped the guillotine. He raised a shaking hand, pointing a crooked finger directly at my chest. "You have destroyed this family, Beatrice," he hissed, his voice echoing thinly in the vast cavernous space. The sound was ragged and wet, lacking any of its usual booming power. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle to ruin us because you were always jealous of your brother. I hope you are happy with what you have done. You will die alone just like David." The mention of my husband, his name in that man, his filthy mouth, was the final absolute trigger. I felt a surge of cold, lethal energy flood my veins, but I did not lose my composure. I did not shout. I did not flinch. I did not retreat a single millimeter. Instead, I stepped directly into his personal space. I moved with a fluid, predatory grace, closing the distance between us until I was mere inches from his face. I towered over his slumped, defeated frame, forcing him to look up at me. I forced him to look directly into the eyes of the powerful, wealthy woman I had become entirely without his help. He tried to maintain his glare, but his eyes darted away, unable to withstand the absolute lethal certainty in my gaze. He was a bully who had finally met a force he could not manipulate or intimidate. "David did not die alone," I stated, my voice a low, terrifying rumble that made him physically recoil. Every word was a meticulously crafted weapon designed to strike the deepest vulnerabilities of his ego. He died knowing he was loved fiercely, and he died protecting me from parasites exactly like you. I took another half step forward, forcing Richard to press his back flat against the cold stone pillar. You, on the other hand, will die knowing your entire legacy is a fraud. I continued slicing through his remaining dignity without a shred of hesitation. You will spend your final miserable years knowing your golden boy is a federal inmate. You will lie in whatever cheap bed you manage to afford, knowing your bloodline is entirely bankrupt. You built an empire on lies. Richard and I just bought the ashes. You are nothing. Richard seemed to physically shrink under the immense, crushing weight of my words. The last spark of defiance in his eyes extinguished entirely, leaving behind only a hollow, empty void. He slid down the surface of the pillar, collapsing back onto the floor, a completely broken man. I turned my attention away from him, dismissing his existence, and looked at Patricia. She was trembling violently, her expensive designer clothes looking suddenly ridiculous and oversized on her shrinking frame. She looked at Richard slumped on the floor, then at the empty hallway where Trent had fled, then finally at me. I could see the gears turning in her panicked mind. Her entire support system had evaporated. Her husband was ruined. Her son was a fugitive. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her mind was desperately searching for a new host, a new safety net to latch onto. She took a shaky, hesitant step forward. She raised a trembling, perfectly manicured hand, reaching out toward my arm. The sheer, unadulterated delusion required to seek comfort from the daughter she had just tried to rob was staggering. "Beatrice, please," she whimpered, a pathetic, sickening attempt at maternal affection. Her voice quivered with manufactured vulnerability. "We are still your parents. You cannot just leave us like this. Please, Beatrice." I stepped smoothly out of her reach, looking at her outstretched hand with utter repulsion. The emotional manipulation that used to paralyze me as a child now held absolutely zero power. It was like watching a venomous snake try to perform a magic trick. "Do not ever contact me again," I said, delivering the final absolute boundary. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, offering no anger, no sadness, and absolutely no hope for reconciliation. "If you call me, I will block the number. If you show up at my office or my home, my private security will treat you as hostile trespassers, and they will have you arrested. You are dead to me, too." Patricia let out a quiet, choking sob, clutching her arms to her chest as if trying to hold her shattered reality together. I did not wait to see if she would fall to the floor beside her husband. I turned my back on the two people who had brought me into this world, and I walked away. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, a steady, confident beat that announced my departure. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the bright, blinding afternoon sunlight, leaving the darkness entirely behind me. I turned my back on the two people who had brought me into this world. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not hesitate. The long marble hallway of the municipal building stretched out before me, a vast corridor of polished stone and heavy shadows. Every step I took resonated through the empty space. The sharp staccato click of my heels against the marble floor echoed with absolute finality. It sounded like a gavel striking a sound block over and over again, delivering the final verdict on the Wilson family dynasty. With every step, the suffocating gravity of my childhood fell away. I was leaving them to the ruins of their own making. I could still hear the faint, ragged sound of Richard gasping for air, and the pathetic, muffled whimpers of my mother echoing behind me. Those sounds used to trigger an immediate, conditioned response in my brain. For 34 years, I had been trained to rush to their side to fix their problems, to absorb their anger, and to apologize for my mere existence. Now those sounds were nothing but meaningless background noise. They held absolutely zero power over me. I was completely immune to their suffering because they had engineered every single ounce of it themselves. As I approached the grand vestibule leading to the main exterior exit, I passed a massive antique mirror mounted against the stone wall. Its ornate gilded frame was tarnished with age, but the glass was perfectly clear. I stopped. The rhythmic clicking of my heels ceased abruptly, leaving the hallway in total silence. I turned my head and looked directly at my own reflection. I stared at the woman in the glass. She was entirely unrecognizable from the scapegoat daughter who used to shrink under Richard, his booming voice. She was nothing like the anxious, people-pleasing girl who used to starve herself to fit into Patricia, her impossible standards of high society perfection. The woman looking back at me was a predator. She was a CEO. She was the sole architect of her own survival. My posture was rigid and flawless, my tailored charcoal suit draped over my shoulders like modern armor. The $20,000 Birkin bag rested on my forearm not as a fashion accessory, but as a literal spoil of war. I looked absolutely untouchable. I raised my left hand and lightly brushed my fingertips against the small, elegant gold wedding band still resting on my ring finger. The metal was cool and familiar against my skin. It was the only piece of jewelry I wore that possessed any actual value. It was a silent promise kept to the only man who had ever truly seen me. David had not lived long enough to see me dismantle the empire that tried to crush us, but his belief in me was the foundation I had built this entire execution upon. When the doctors delivered his terminal diagnosis, my family had immediately started circling like vultures waiting to pick his assets clean. They thought his death would break me. They thought losing him would render me weak, compliant, and easily manipulated. They had wildly miscalculated. Losing David did not break me. It forged me into something lethal. It burned away every remaining shred of my tolerance for their toxicity. I survived the wolves, David, I whispered to my reflection, the words barely carrying in the quiet hall. I survived them, and I slaughtered the entire pack. I lowered my hand, dropping my arm back to my side. I held my head high, locked my jaw, and turned away from the mirror. I approached the massive, heavy brass doors that separated the courthouse from the outside world. I placed both hands flat against the cool metal and pushed with my entire body weight. The heavy doors groaned in protest before swinging outward, giving way to the outside world. The bright midday sun hit my face immediately. The sheer brilliance of it was temporarily blinding, but I did not shield my eyes. I stepped out onto the wide granite landing and breathed in the fresh Boston air. The city was alive with noise. The distant wail of a siren, the aggressive honking of taxicabs, the low hum of thousands of people moving through their day. It was chaotic and beautiful. I stood at the top of the courthouse steps and took a deep, steadying breath. My lungs expanded, fully filling with crisp, unburdened air. There were absolutely no tears in my eyes. There was not a single fraction of an ounce of regret in my heart. The guilt that society demands of daughters who walk away from their toxic parents was completely absent. I felt only pure, unadulterated liberation. The chain was cut. The debt was settled. The ledgers were completely balanced. I owned my life entirely. I began my descent down the wide stone steps, moving with effortless grace toward the bustling street level. I did not look back at the imposing facade of the municipal building. There was nothing left inside those walls that concerned me. I had extracted everything of value and left the rot behind to collapse on itself. As my feet hit the public sidewalk, a sleek, black, armored Cadillac Escalade slid smoothly through the heavy downtown traffic and pulled up directly to the curb in front of me. The vehicle stopped with absolute precision. The heavy passenger side door swung open immediately. My executive assistant, Vance, stepped out onto the pavement. He was dressed in a sharp, immaculate navy suit, an earpiece resting discreetly in his left ear. His posture was rigid, his expression highly professional, and completely unreadable. He offered a crisp, respectful nod as he held the armored door open for me. "Is it done?" Ma'am Vance asked, his voice calm and perfectly steady, cutting through the ambient noise of the city street. "It is done, Vance," I replied, stepping past him into the cavernous rear cabin of the Escalade. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing us inside a meticulously designed fortress of acoustic glass and reinforced steel. The chaotic symphony of the Boston streets was instantly muted, replaced by the faint hum of the vehicle, his climate control system. This was not merely a mode of transportation. It was a mobile command center custom, outfitted with secure communication arrays, encrypted Wi-Fi, and twin monitor screens embedded into the partition. It was the physical manifestation of the absolute control I now wielded over my life and my assets. I sank into the plush black leather seat, letting the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. For the first time in my entire existence, my posture did not have to serve as a defense mechanism. I was entirely untouchable. Vance slid smoothly into the seat opposite mine, his movements practiced and highly efficient. He reached into his leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek silver tablet, passing it across the center console with a precise nod. The emergency board meeting concluded 10 minutes ago. Ma'am Vance stated, his tone maintaining its usual professional cadence. The vote was completely unanimous. I took the tablet, letting my eyes scan the encrypted corporate memo displayed on the glowing screen. The board of directors at Richard, his former firm, the massive holding company he had spent 3 decades meticulously building to exclude me, had officially convened the moment my legal team filed the federal fraud injunctions. They were ruthless corporate survivors who immediately recognized blood in the water. The second they saw the undeniable proof of Richard and Trent, their financial crimes, they moved to protect their own interests. They severed all ties with the Wilson patriarch, stripping him of his executive powers, his shares, and his pension. And to stabilize the plummeting stock prices, they had voted to install me as the new chairwoman. I traced my finger over the digital signatures on the screen. Richard had always explicitly told me that women did not possess the emotional fortitude to run an empire. He had groomed Trent from childhood to inherit the throne spoon, feeding him every advantage and overlooking every catastrophic failure. Now that throne was mine. I had not just taken his wealth, I had taken his legacy, and I was going to completely overwrite it. There is a secondary update regarding Trent. Vance continued tapping his own earpiece as a secure message relayed to his device. Special Agent Miller just confirmed the interception. Federal agents apprehended Trent at Logan International Airport approximately 12 minutes ago. I looked up from the tablet, a sharp, cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. Logan, I repeated. Where exactly was the golden boy trying to run? He was attempting to board a commercial flight to Cancun, Mexico, Vance replied, pulling up a live surveillance feed sent over by the agency. He purchased a one-way ticket in cash and tried to bypass the security checkpoint using his secondary passport. The agents detained him at the gate. I watched the silent video feed playing out on the tablet screen. Trent was standing in the middle of a crowded airport terminal surrounded by armed federal agents. He was sobbing hysterically, his custom suit completely disheveled, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. Dozens of travelers were watching the spectacle, holding up their phones to record the absolute humiliation of a disgraced hedge fund manager. There was no grand master plan. There was no sophisticated extraction strategy. When faced with the terrifying reality of his own actions, Trent had simply panicked and tried to run to a tourist beach town like a common petty thief. He was going to spend the best years of his life in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and he had absolutely no one to blame but himself. I locked the tablet screen and set it down on the polished wood of the center console. I reached over and retrieved a crystal tumbler from the built-in beverage chiller, pouring myself a measure of crisp, sparkling water. The sharp carbonation crackled softly in the quiet cabin. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the lingering bitter taste of the courthouse. The armored SUV shifted into gear, pulling smoothly away from the curb and merging into the heavy afternoon traffic. I turned my head and looked out through the heavily tinted bulletproof window. The dark glass provided a perfect one-way mirror, allowing me to observe the street without being seen. Richard and Patricia had finally emerged from the heavy brass doors of the municipal building. They stood on the wide granite landing, blinking blindly in the harsh midday sunlight. They looked entirely disoriented. Richard was leaning heavily on his wife, his face gaunt and pale, his expensive suit hanging off his suddenly frail frame. Patricia was clutching her designer handbag, her ruined makeup making her look decades older than her carefully maintained socialite age. They were wandering aimlessly down the stone steps, completely stripped of their vast wealth, their untouchable social status, and their precious golden child. They were ghosts, haunting a city they used to own. They had no home to return to. They had no bank accounts to access. They had absolutely nothing left but the crushing weight of their own catastrophic failures. I watched them for exactly 3 seconds. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering anger. They were simply strangers standing on a sidewalk entirely irrelevant to my existence. I broke eye contact with the window, turning away from the past for the absolute final time. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my sleek silver laptop, opening it on my lap. The bright screen illuminated my face, highlighting the sharp, intense focus in my eyes. The slate was completely wiped clean. The debt was settled. The future was a massive blank canvas waiting for my signature. Set a meeting with the full board of directors for 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I commanded, my fingers already flying across the keyboard to draft the initial restructuring protocols. We have an empire to rebuild. Understood? Chairwoman Vance replied, tapping a final command into his device. The armored SUV accelerated smoothly, disappearing into the relentless flow of traffic as it sped toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the city. Sometimes the most profound betrayals come from those who share your blood. The hardest lesson is learning that family isn't defined by genetics, but by mutual respect. When toxic relatives mistake your patience for weakness, walking away isn't a failure. It is your ultimate act of self-preservation. You owe absolutely nothing to people who only value you for what they can extract. Reclaim your narrative. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary to protect your own peace? Share your experiences in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe for more stories of ultimate resilience and triumph.